We'll just ask everybody to please begin taking your seats. We'll be getting underway in just a few moments. Could we ask everybody to please begin taking your seats? We'll be getting underway. And if you wouldn't mind moving in to leave room on the ends of the aisles, because we expect we're having more people continue to come in, please. Thank you.
Welcome everyone. Welcome to the Catalytic Climate Capital Forum. Hope everyone's had a fantastic climate week this week. How's everyone's feet feeling? Tired? How's the speech? You've been talking all week. Well, we're not here to talk. We're here to learn. We're here to take action. So please, everyone that's still standing, please take your seats. We have an exciting program for you today. For those tuning in online, welcome. Thank you for joining us. If you have any questions throughout the course of today, please feel free to use the live chat feature. Our staff will be definitely monitoring and responding, and we will have a Q&A. So here's how today works. We're going to start with a panel focusing on catalytic climate capital. Of course, it wouldn't be on the right slide. We're going to start with the catalytic climate capital panel and the opportunities, of course, that it presents. Then we're going to have a Q&A from the audience. After a break, we'll dive into our next exciting panel, which is energy transition opportunity in the Caribbean. We plan to close by 11:45, and those in the room, feel free to help yourself to refreshments at any time, but please, for those who are tall enough, do duck when you go under the camera there. So, reflecting on Climate Week, key themes have really started emerging that underscore really what our mission is today in mobilizing climate finance, in particular private finance, and even more particularly to the emerging markets, those countries which need it most. The urgency has become pretty obvious, and we've been reminded by that throughout the week. De-risking commercial uncertainties in those markets is also pretty critical, and for those of you in the private sector here today, I see many of you that I know, please keep up the good work. Remember, though, that the local contexts and the existential threats need to be taken into consideration. Simultaneously, we need to obviously address emissions reductions and poverty alleviation, particularly in the growing emerging markets. The big question here as the world unites around a very historic COP28 focused on finance is the tripling of renewable energy by 2030 and preparing obviously also for the NCQG, which is the new Collective Quantified Goal, replacing the 100 billion. This is going to happen at COP29, and it's a very important point for us. A question, obviously, that hangs over this ambition and why we're here today is how can public, private, and now even more so philanthropic capital catalyze additional private investments to drive the energy transition. Today, and for the first panel, we're bringing together global leaders to explore how private capital can be mobilized through catalytic means and instruments, from the latest innovations to, obviously, the opportunities for advancing the energy transition and adaptation. More importantly, we'll hear more about growing philanthropic partnerships that are accelerating the clean energy transition in emerging markets and developing countries. So I want to ask everyone a question here very quickly. How many people here are actually involved in catalytic climate capital? Hands, a show of hands, please. Well, there's a good few people. Can I also have people shout out in the room and maybe even type into the live chat, what do you think a catalytic instrument is? Anyone? Come on, my panelists can shout out catalytic instruments too. Grants? Any takers? Guarantees? First loss. Anything else? Here we go. Great. Well, it's obvious that we have quite a knowledgeable audience here today. Even though not quite engaged, I do not blame you. It is Friday at the end of Climate Week, and we really appreciate you showing up. I'd like to turn things over to my colleague, my boss, my compadre, our Managing Director of the Global South Program, and the person that kicked off the Catalytic Capital initiative at RMI, EJ Okeke.
Thank you, Ben, for waking up the room. Good morning, everyone. Good morning, everyone. Power through. Let's power through. This is the last day. No, but thank you for joining us for what promises to be hopefully an edifying and engaging conversation about catalytic climate capital. But I think it's important that we, first of all, define it, just very broadly, what is catalytic climate capital. We heard Ben mention a few types and use cases of catalytic capital. And okay, I think it works better when it's close.
Press down. You need a roaming mic as well.
So very broadly defined, it's any form of financial resources that take a disproportionate amount of risk or a lower or concessionary return in order to bring third-party private sector capital that otherwise would not participate in a transaction. So it needs to be necessary. We don't want to be unnecessarily subsidizing the private sector. And it needs to have a mobilizing role to bring in the private sector. But what's new in this space? I think, first of all, what we're seeing is a lot more initiatives and job titles with catalytic climate in it, including mine. But I think what it speaks to is that there's a lot of attention and resources being placed into this space that ordinarily we haven't seen historically. I am pressing down. Okay. So a couple of things that we're seeing in terms of how the sector is evolving. The first is what I would say is in a seeding category, right? We're seeing a lot of initiatives that are looking at more frontier ways of addressing market interventions, perhaps around more frontier levels of areas of impact, whether it's adaptation instead of mitigation that we're all comfortable with, or looking at climate tech interventions, or looking at frontier geographies in sub-Saharan Africa and Asia, where we're not seeing a lot of capital being deployed. But it's also a second category that I'm seeing is really around what I call scaling. I think arguably we are in a punctuated moment where a number of structures that have been deployed and piloted are ready for scale. And we're seeing that now in the market where we have at least 4 billion plus platforms in blended finance and in catalytic capital. We're also seeing a higher leverage ratio in terms of the amount of, so there's less philanthropic or donor capital needed to mobilize more from the private sector. We're also seeing, for me, which is really exciting, a lot of private sector leadership where institutional investors are really leading the charge in developing and initiating some of these platforms. A couple examples. Recently, Allianz launched the SDG Loan Fund, which is a $1 billion plus fund that combines philanthropic capital, donor government capital from a DFI, and of course capital from Allianz itself and other institutional investors. We're also seeing MUFG and the Gaia platform, which is a $1.5 billion platform that also MUFG is anchoring and brings in all of those different participants. So we're seeing some fairly large platforms being stood up in the space. And that's all very promising, but a lot more needs to be done. And that's the slide that we have here. So we understand why we're here in the first place and why we're doing this. We've made a lot of progress, but the gaps are still very significant. Of all of the countries that have committed to tripling renewable energy and doubling down on energy efficiency, only 14 countries have actually set targets. We're all quite familiar with the climate finance gap. We need 4 times what we're deploying currently if we're to mitigate the impacts of climate change, and if we're to help a lot of geographies in the global south decarbonize and address their energy transition goals. And then when we look at electrification, over 800 million people do not have access to electricity. And as each of these countries pursue their electrification goals, as they should, or as each of these countries choose to industrialize, we need to make sure that they have decarbonized pathways to do so. And then also in the technology space, only about 37% of technologies that we think would be so critical in ensuring that we meet our goals are actually being commercialized to date. So there's significant gaps and significant needs across the ecosystem. Now in this slide, which I won't go through in much detail, it just really presents the full universe of structures, interventions that we're seeing in catalytic climate capital, and various institutions are pursuing some flavor of this. But at the left-hand side, you have where you have probably the highest risk, and where philanthropic and donor capital is probably most impactful and most needed, really in helping with early stage de-risking, either of clean energy projects in frontier markets or of climate tech ventures that need early stage support. As you go down the investment or project life cycle, you start to see more blended finance instruments that can be deployed at scale, looking at later stage equity investments or debt investments. And then finally, as these investments mature, you can look at securitization products and different types of impact bonds that can come in and help recycle the capital. Now, I think it's important that we talk about a few case studies of what RMI is doing in this space and what we're supporting, either leading or supporting tangentially. The first one here is the CARICOM Community Resilience Fund. This is a $135 million fund, and the first resilience fund in the Caribbean. It's also one that has both a debt subfund and an equity subfund, both of which are using philanthropic funding provided by the CARICOM Development Fund, anchored by the CARICOM Development Fund, to do two things. First is to fund a junior loss tranche that sits in both the sub-debt fund and the equity fund. But the other interesting intervention is they've set aside a technical assistance facility, because there's a recognition that a lot of philanthropic capital can be used to build out the pipeline of investable opportunities for the actual fund. So the TA is used for early stage project preparation and support for a number of potential investment opportunities in the region. This is one that was put together by collaboration from a number of parties. USAID provided some early stage support. RMI will be providing technical assistance in building out the pipeline. The CARICOM Development Fund provided anchor capital, and Cygnus is the fund manager, an experienced fund manager in the region that is now looking at launching their first climate intervention. The second one is actually quite interesting. It's one that we're doing in India, and it's looking at ways of mobilizing affordable commercial debt to support e-mobility in India. Now, when people think of e-mobility, they think of cars. But in India, we're looking at one of the most popular forms of transportation, which is 2- and 3-wheelers. In a lot of emerging markets, that is what we call popular transportation, and it's used to transport people and goods. And it's a tremendous source of greenhouse gas emissions, and we're looking at ways of accelerating adoption of 2- and 3-wheelers in that country, and that will require affordable loans. And it's a new market that a lot of banks are not comfortable lending to. And we're partnering with local financial institution, SIDBI, which is a small industry development bank of India, to provide a guarantee. We have Shell Foundation and the World Bank providing some concessional first loss capital for the risk-sharing facility. And then we have local financial institutions that are providing the capital to lend to this space. Now, it's the expectation that this facility can fund about 30,000 2- and 3-wheelers in India. It's a small amount, a small bucket. But the idea behind some of these interventions is to really put forward something that provides a demonstration to the market, right? The expectation is that the private sector, if if this is successful, in future iterations, we'll be able to drive more of these facilities and deploy more of these facilities as they become more comfortable with the repayment and performance of the loans in this sector. The other important expected impact is how we can replicate this in other markets. There are similar markets in Asia and in Africa where 2-, 3-wheelers are prevalent. We're looking at replicating this in Indonesia next, and then Nigeria in sub-Saharan Africa. So these sorts of initiatives for us provide that demonstration, but also the replication potential. The last one I want to talk about is one of our most recent facilities, and it's called Mark I, and I think Julian is in the crowd somewhere. He's the CEO of Mark I. But this is a JV between a Third Derivative and Deep Science Ventures, and it's looking specifically at bringing first-of-a-kind technologies to market, commercializing promising climate tech innovations, but oftentimes don't have access to capital, right, and the capex needed to do first-of-a-kind commercialization of these ventures. And by so doing, it helps them avoid what they call the valley of death. I mean, there's several valleys of death, but this one is one that addresses that commercialization gap. And these technologies oftentimes have potential to have gigaton scale impact in climate. And so it's important, they're an important necessary ingredient for us to help to reach our net zero targets. But it looks at different ways of stacking capital. So there's philanthropic intervention, there are returnable grants embedded in that, and then on top of that, we have impact-focused but return-seeking capital that's senior to the philanthropic interventions. So I just thought it would be great to go through a few case studies. In the panel discussion today, we will hear from experts that are also implementing different and exciting interventions. But I do want to leave everyone with a closing thought. And while it's important that we scale catalytic climate capital, I do want to remind us that that is not the end goal. This is an intermediary step. Ultimately, we want to scale commercial capital into climate. And so hopefully, a number of us that are in the catalytic climate space will work ourselves out of a job and have new titles if we're successful. Thank you.
Thanks so much, EJ. Oh, might need the microphone. Thanks so much, EJ. Well, now, without further ado, tremendously honored to welcome to our stage our truly inspirational panelists and experts in the catalytic climate capital space. First of all, I'd like Filippo Bernardi, Head of Climate Change Mitigation of the Global Environment Facility, to come and join us at the stage, the GEF. Next, Geraldine Alias from Three Cairns Group. She's the managing director there. And then Carla Orego, Global Senior Manager of Innovative Finance at Climate Policy Initiative. And then Dan Ferger, last but not least, the founding and managing partner of Great Circle Capital Advisors, and also advisor for sustainable finance at the Bezos Earth Fund. Sorry, should I have it up? Well, really excited to have everyone here today. I'm sure the audience are as well. Really interested to hear some of the case studies and examples, and distill a little bit of knowledge from the work that y'all have been doing around catalytic climate capital. Let's dive right in. Filippo, I'll start with you. First question is, Sounds like a game show, doesn't it? Can you briefly explain the role of the Global Environment Facility and other sort of multilateral funds out there in the catalytic capital space, and the role you play particularly in leveraging public, private, and now also philanthropic capital?
Sure. If I get the mic. Can you hear me? Yes. Okay, great. Well, first of all, Ben, thanks a lot for the invite. It's an honor for me to be here. The room is packed, so congratulations. So my name is Filippo. I lead the climate change mitigation work at the Global Environment Facility. For those of you who are not familiar, the GEF is a sort of multilateral financial mechanism under the UN Convention on Climate Change. So we are essentially a government-to-government funding mechanism. But we do also do work on sort of the private sector, sort of blended finance realm. So essentially, our role is to support countries in their transition to lower carbon economies. And how do you do that? Well, first of all, we take a role of supporting them in everything that is related to their regulatory and sort of policy framework. So this goes a little bit beyond what we are discussing here, but perhaps is the upstream sort of enabling condition that are necessary for private sector to come in. When the private sector look at an emerging economy for a climate investment, the type of determination that company will do in a climate investment is not dissimilar from the determination that we'll have to do for any other investment. So if we have a problem with attracting investments in, let's say, a country X in sub-Saharan Africa, we ought to look at how we solve that in any type of investment before we can then sort of unlock catalytic funding for climate. So for us, is super important to continue to provide that type of assistance, supporting analytics and data management to try and provide the governments with the tools to define policies that are suitable for private sector investments. And that could be, for instance, reforming electricity tariff when it comes to decentralized renewable energy and giving the private sector developer the opportunity to have tariff that help them recover the cost of generating the clean energy. So that is one first sort of role of multilateral funds. Then the second role, more related to the concept of catalytic finance, which, by the way, is very close to blended finance. Until now, we spoke about blended finance. Now, I think catalytic has a slightly different meaning, but a lot of overlap. So in that sense, we do essentially two things. A pre-competitive support for pipeline development. So when a government look at, for instance, auctioning a certain number of sites for clean energy generation, they will have to develop this site. They will have to do initial studies, and so that the private sector can come in and take those information and decide whether they want to bid or not. So that particular work is something that we can support. And then after, the next step will be when the private sector will have to put together initial feasibility study for their project, we can provide that support so that the upfront costs that are not directly related to the cash flow of the project once it is built and operating can also be sort of smoothed out, and again, we can incentivize private sector investment. And the third part is at transaction level, and this relate very much to what IJ was saying, both at portfolio level. For instance, if we have an investment vehicle and the investment vehicle sort of need de-risking capital, be that a junior loan, equity tranche, first loss guarantee, then normally climate funds such as the JEF are able to provide that with the view of de-risking investment. Now, the way you decide the particular instrument, financial instrument that you will use in that particular transaction depends on the type of technology, the type of country, the credit risk that local financial institutions will have to deal with. And I think we can talk about that perhaps in the next step.
Absolutely. And thanks, Filippo, for sort of really laying the groundwork there in terms of what the private sector needs in terms of enabling environment. I'm sure many people here have heard that word before, but it goes much deeper than policies and incentives. And it'll be awesome to hear a little bit more about that later, particularly how, early stage finance for projects as Catalytic, as you started to dive into there. Next question is over to Dan. So really through your work with Great Circle Capital Advisors and your collaborations with various philanthropies, such as the Bezos Earth Fund and Bloomberg Philanthropies, really, can you give us a little bit of a flavor or a bit of an overview of the increasing role that philanthropy is now playing in this space and trying to leverage additional private capital? Maybe tell us a little bit more beyond philanthropies and about family offices and the role that they can also play as well in the emerging landscape of catalytic finance solutions. Over to you.
Thank you, Ben. It's great to be here. It's great to see a full room on a Friday morning at the end of a very long week, so thank you all for joining. I'm sort of an accidental philanthropy person, but I've now been doing it one way or another for almost a decade, so I feel like I do know a thing or two about how this weird and opaque world actually works from the inside. The first thing to say is there's more philanthropic capital focused on climate than ever before. In part, there's more rich people in the world than ever before, and they're giving out more money, just generally. But the climate emergency is so grave that increasingly people are starting to say, I'd like to do something about this. That's a great thing. Philanthropy is the most flexible, patient, risk-tolerant, at least in theory, pool of capital available in the sort of theoretical capital stack we all have been talking about here today and this week. And that's a good thing. But along with that flexibility comes unaccountability, undemocratic decision-making, opacity, people who change their minds in various ways, and a set of very idiosyncratic, I would say, constraints based on the source of that capital, which is, as it, I guess, should be. It's the person's or family's decision what to do with it. Or the board of trustees of a large institution like, I don't know, Rockefeller Foundation. What that means for any particular project proponent, fund manager, MDB, DFI, government, NGO partner, is that you've got to think about the incentive structure on the other side of the equation, and it's often a very difficult and slow-moving and capricious process to partner with a philanthropic source of capital. So even though, I'm not here to throw cold water on the whole conversation, there's all sorts of good things which we'll talk about, but even though in theory, everyone wants it, everyone thinks it's the most attractive source of capital to kind of get the ball rolling on a new fund, you could come in and anchor our thing, it's first of a kind, you can take the risk, no one else is able to, they're all constrained. The reality is, from my lived experience, I'll just talk about Mike Bloomberg a little bit, and I work now with the Bezos Earth Fund, which is, by the way, not a fund. It's $10 billion of grant capital that Jeff Bezos is giving away. So that's one complication. The reasons why any donor, any philanthropic platform, and the people who work there get involved in something can really depend on where they see opportunity to have impact, to scale solutions, or to do things that they want to see happen in the world. So, at Bezos, we are involved in supporting ACP, which Geraldine will talk about, for a very specific set of reasons, which we had conversations with Jeff, and he agreed to say yes, right? That's not necessarily an open door to any other fund in the world that has similar characteristics. It's not like we have this dedicated pool of flexible capital just available. And there's also, I would say, I'll just talk about Bloomberg for 1 second, a sort of, if the imperative, as EJ said in the slides earlier, is to scale the pool of available capital to solve climate solutions, particularly in the global south, there's always this kind of question. Yes, these pools of capital are vast and limitless, and you don't necessarily trade off, at least at Bloomberg, between doing one thing here and doing something else over there. There's more to go around. That's a nice thing about working with someone who has so much available resource. There is, though, a question about what is the thing that we can do that will scale this capital most quickly, right? So Bloomberg famously set up this terrible acronym a couple years ago called GFANS in Glasgow, and the theory of the case there was, yes, Mike could put in some money into one fund and be an LP in Mark Carney's Brookfield strategy, whatever, but we could also convene the entire market and shape the conversation around scaling catalytic capital in emerging markets. Now, we can have a debate about whether that was a good use of attention, resource, bandwidth, et cetera, but there's this kind of dichotomy often in family offices and foundations between working in the climate finance system, meaning I'm going to be an LP in a fund, I'm going to stand up a new platform, I'm going to do a deal, then you negotiate the terms and figure out what you get for what kind of impact and what kind of governance rights you get for that participation, versus instead of working in the system, working on the system. And there you might say, look, I'd rather spend my time pushing Ajay Banga through the private sector investment lab to do things more catalytically at the World Bank with that pool of capital, which is vastly bigger than any philanthropic donor can muster. And my marginal additional philanthropic dollar is probably better spent on getting the US Treasury to put pressure on the IMF to do SDR reform. And that'll open up more capital for emerging markets than any individual deal that I can do will make available. Now, it's not always that obvious trade-off. It's not one or the other, but those are some of the things that go on inside these big organizations, and it often is frustrating to the outsider, kind of thinking, well, why can't I just, you have this money, why can't I have some of it to do the impactful thing that I'm trying to do? So I hope that starts to shed a little bit of light on how people think.
Yeah, that was extremely insightful. Is the microphone? Yeah, extremely insightful, and I think like a deeper look into some of the more advocacy roles in pushing the global financial institution architecture towards mobilizing more capital and using their capital in more riskier ways. And I think really important that you outline there, looking to where the opportunities are. And I think, Carla, you can really speak to looking at where the opportunities are. 10 years ago, Climate Policy Initiative launched another lab very similar, well, not too dissimilar to the private sector lab at the World Bank, which they've only just launched just recently, but congratulations to the World Bank for leading that work. But CPI launched the Lab for Climate Finance, and now you're also working with Convergence through the Catalytic Climate Finance Facility. Through both of these institutions, these labs have really been key drivers in scaling blended finance. And as I heard yesterday, and as Carla corrected me this morning, they've managed to mobilize $4.1 billion of finance through the Climate Finance Lab. So briefly, how does the lab, and also a little bit into your work with Convergence through the Catalytic Climate Finance Facility, and I'm not using acronyms here, what are some of the critical lessons that you've learned, and how can these be applied to future projects?
Sure. Well, thanks, Ben and EJ, for the invitation today. My name is Carla Reo. I'm with CPI. For those of you not familiar with CPI, we are an analytical and advisory organization that works in the intersection of finance, policy, and climate with the ultimate goal of, as you were saying, mobilizing private capital into climate action. So one of our major streams of work is innovative finance, as we call it, where we have these acceleration programs that Ben was mentioning. The Global Innovation Lab for Climate Finance, the LAB for short, so that's one acronym, and the Catalytic Climate Finance Facility, or CC Facility for short as well, so it's easier to talk through those. And these are both the flagship programs that CPI managed. So the lab was launched 10 years ago with the mandate to design financial mechanisms that could de-risk the different transactions or projects that were happening in the global south and bring in the private sector. So over 10 years of operations now, we have a portfolio of 71 instruments we call instruments to different financial mechanisms that help regulate the flow of money into the projects of the ground, essentially, with different financial innovation that we use. And it has mobilized, as Ben was saying, over 4.1 billion, of which about 45% is from private sources. So this is ultimately what we want to see. We have used a lot of concessional capital to de-risk these projects and bring the private sector into the mix and participating in these transactions. So shifting into the Catalytic Climate Finance Facility, this is meant to be the continuation of the lab. It is focused on ideas that already have proof of concepts or pilots on the ground and help them scale up. So one thing is the need to help different proponents, especially in the Global South, to test these business models that they are leading and then help them scale, because the operation at the earlier stage and the later stage are way different. So what we have learned in 10 years, right? I want to highlight 3 things, but the first thing is we need to act faster, right? The climate finance gap is increasing exponentially. Last year, we reached the 1 trillion mark for the first time in annual climate finance flows, but we still need to increase that 5-fold at least annually if we want to get to the 2030 targets that we have set. So 3 things. The first one is that we need to build an ecosystem. We need to bring all the relevant stakeholders into the equation, not only the public-private sector, which we always talk about that, but the local actors. So we're talking about local institutions, local beneficiaries, local developers, and with this in mind, the lab transition after 5 years or so into a hub-and-spoke model where we have regional labs, or sub-labs as we call it, with local experts as part of the panels and helping the proponents on the ground and sourcing ideas led by local teams. So this is the first thing. The second thing is that it's very important to have both funding and technical assistance. We have seen that both independently are useful, but it takes a longer runway to market to deploy the ideas if they are not paired together. Because on one side, if you only do technical assistance, it takes about 2 years or so to secure either grant capital from philanthropic sources or concessional sources to implement a proof of concept or a pilot. And if you only deploy funding without technical assistance, in many cases, some of these teams don't know how to navigate the ecosystem and have a successful implementation. So this is one of the major takeaways that we had after several years of the lab, and the reason why we launched the Catalytic Climate Finance Facility in partnership with Convergence to bring a combined package of both and go with the proponents along the journey in the implementation of their projects. And recently, yesterday, we announced a pre-seed capital facility within the lab to also help the proponents that have an idea that's ready for the market to implement that on the ground. And the final thing I want to say is that innovation doesn't have to be too complicated. Innovation can be boring. We don't need to reinvent the wheel. We need to apply things that have worked in different contexts, like new sectors or new regions, things that have worked in the developed world that can be applied in the developing countries. So we don't think of innovation as something too complicated, but something that is actionable and can basically tackle a specific barrier in a new way that haven't been tried before. So yeah, I will close with that, and then we can continue with more details.
Thanks, Carla. You really hit a few important points on the head there, I think, particularly around the need for grant funding and the lead up. Working capital is definitely critical in getting some of these projects and innovative financial instruments working on the ground first, just keeping the lights on for some of these developers. And I think also, if we're going to need 1.8 trillion per year by 2030, and 1.5 of that specifically for clean energy and the energy transition, I think we really need to start focusing on shifting that capital. Now, the next question is for Geraldine specifically on that. 3 ACP, Allied Climate Partners, for those who don't know what ACP is a mission-driven entity really focused on mobilizing the maximum amount of capital possible to mitigation and adaptation, particularly in emerging markets. Can you tell us a little bit about the role of ACP and in particular how your catalytic investments and the role that you play is going to help leverage more of that necessary private capital, particularly, and public capital as well, I have to add, particularly in those emerging markets.
Thank you so much. Is this working? Oh, yeah. So thank you so much. As you said, my name is Geraldine Alias. I work for Three Karens Group, which is a mission-driven philanthropic investment firm focused on climate action. And we incubated and spun out Allied Climate Partners, which is, as Ben described, a philanthropic investment organization focused on trying to figure out how to unlock climate finance bottlenecks in emerging economies. So that's the link between the two for some folks that were a little confused. And we use commercially oriented risk capital to do that. And so actually the entire way that sort of ACP was created was around how to use minimally concessional, high leverage capital to unlock these bottlenecks. And sort of as Dan described, there isn't infinite amounts of philanthropic capital. So when you have it, how do you use it in the most high leverage way possible to unlock these bottlenecks? And so the way that we think about it at ACP is sort of in sort of three ways. The first is to pinpoint what the actual problem is, especially on the where you can use the most high leverage capital. And it's usually upstream in the value chain. And it's not the same in all the regions. And in all the emerging markets have different sort of idiosyncrasies. You know, Filippo, you explained a couple things of the obstacles. There are different obstacles. So really pinpointing where that is. And the second one is, and this is, you beautifully orchestrated this panel for me. Carla mentioned local partners. Really identifying who those local partners are that are best situated to help, once you've pinpointed what the problem is, you think is best suited to help you solve that problem. And the third that we do is create this investment vehicle that is to solve the pinpointed problem with the local partner, and we design something that is highly catalytic, where we are minimally concessional, usually first loss, but pari passu on the upside with returns, such that we can use, maybe for every dollar of philanthropic capital that is used for first loss, we get an enormous amount of leverage from the MDBs and the DFIs that we crowd into the investment vehicle that we've designed with the local partners, where we pinpointed the exact problem that we were trying to unlock. So it's the first, ACP announced its first partnership with an organization called Climb Capital. This was the first fund that we anchored and designed. It focused on Southeast Asia, and we were the first loss. We helped design the fund along with Climb Capital and Mason and the partnership there to unlock the bottleneck. And in that case, for Southeast Asia, it was really around early stage product development equity. And so created an investment vehicle and then crowded in the MDBs and the DFIs and some private sector actors to be senior to us. But for every dollar we put in, they put in multiples of that. And that creates leverage. And then EJ, you sort of mentioned something in the beginning, is our hope is that we're going to prove that these types of investments over time are less risky than people think they are. And so hopefully Fund 2, that leverage, the amount that we had to put in to crowd in that capital, will be even less. And then maybe by Fund 3, we won't be needed anymore. So it's kind of strange to be sitting here just trying to have something where you're trying to do something where hopefully you'll no longer have a job in 10 years. But that is exactly what Allied Climate Partners is trying to do. But obviously there's a lot of climate finance bottlenecks and vehicles that we can develop. And so that's just one example. And we're working in many other regions to do that.
Fantastic. Thanks for filling us in. Specifically, I really enjoyed that philanthropic dollars are now leveraging DFI and MDB dollars. We're usually hearing how many dollars can the DFIs and MDBs leverage. But yeah, the role is somehow reversing, and we're seeing this being played a lot more. And just going back to the local partners piece, I'd love to hear from EJ, particularly when it comes to the need for sort of high leverage upstream finance. And we've already seen some of the examples where RMI is working in the space. Where would you like to see sort of the work of the ecosystem go, and what would be the role of sort of RMI and the work that you're doing there?
Yeah, I think that for me, what I'd like to see more of is more implementation, right? And implementation is not an announcement at COP. Implementation is actual capital being deployed to support projects. And I think the best way to really accelerate that is to stop changing things. I think, the climate community is very nerdy and they love to chase the shiny new objects, and, they're always in the lab piloting things. And I think we have enough structures that work, that have been proven. We just need to scale them. And in contrast, the private sector doesn't like too much innovation, right? If you want to move large amounts of capital from institutional investors, you need to keep it simple. You need to show where it's worked, and then you need to just double it. So I think we need to move away from constantly innovating and look to focus on deployment, right? Because we're out of time.
Thanks, CJ. And I think we'll spin it back to Carla after that question there. You've been in the lab 10 years. And I know that literally they've mobilized $4.1 billion, so they've achieved a lot. I think it's 40, how many projects?
71.
71 projects that they've worked on. We want to really sort of think about those 71 projects and sort of synthesize what we're seeing here, what we can scale up, what's some of the best practice that you've seen on the ground. And also, if you could talk a little bit to the partnerships that we've all that's been that cross-cutting theme, like who plays the role of mobilizing capital in which piece of the capital stack.
Yeah, so to my point before, it's very important to have this ecosystem where you have the different stakeholders involved in the development. And to connect this back to the concessional piece, right? It's really important to use the catalytic capital to de-risk these transactions. As Geraldine was saying, this is what ultimately attract the private sector to come in, and the goal over time is that once these instruments start scaling or be replicated, they phase out the concessionality. So one of the key criteria that we have is financial sustainability, and the way we understand financial sustainability is that the instrument design and the pathway to market should consider phasing out concessional capital over time. This will take time in some cases, it depends also on the sector, but we have seen this work. So one of our unicorns, as we call it, in the lab is Climate Investor One, Climate Fund Managers. They have been replicated twice, so it started in the renewable energy sector, then it was applied in the water sector, and the third fund they are launching is in the hydrogen sector. They have mobilized over 2 billion, they have closed 2 funds already. So that's the proof that it works. It takes time, but they have been phasing out the need of concessionality over time. So I would say that's one of the key things that we see at, and also to my point before, we don't need to think about innovation as too complex, right? We're applying things that we have seen have worked in other cases, and try to use that in many cases in different regions. So those are, I would say, like the major points that we see consistently across the instruments that have been successful in the portfolio. And just to give you a number, we have a 69% active portfolio of the 71 that I was mentioning, and we have a 62% capital mobilization rate, which is way higher than traditional incubators and accelerator models. Maybe here people are familiar with the YC incubator, and they have a 50% funding success rate. So we are seeing the numbers playing out over time. It takes time, of course, but yeah, we're seeing that the model is working. So that's encouraging.
Thanks, Carla. Really importantly, I think you hit a really important note there about phasing out the concessionality. Essentially, these projects should be de-risking the market, removing barriers, enabling environment conditions, and creating incentives. And you touched on that a little bit earlier. I'm just wondering, with that in respect and the fact that there is a limited pools of public capital to start mobilizing, and you obviously have to report back to the governments that provide money to the GEF and the concessional capital that you're distributing. So the question is sort of, over time, how is the GEF's approach to using that funding, that limited funding, and trying to leverage more and more private investment? How has that changed over time?
That's an excellent question. Hello? Yeah. Basically, we get asked, we get pulled from different directions. No? Our donors want more innovation, more leverage. And then when we look at things happening on the ground, we kept being reminded that perhaps those leverage ratios in particular sectors are really not feasible. I mean, we were in a panel yesterday talking about decentralized renewable energy for off-grid access, and I happened to mention leverage ratio that we normally look for private sector of 1 to 10, and that didn't go down very well, and some of the participants were saying that we should just swallow the pill and call it what it is. When more grants are needed, put down the grants if we really want to get to those objectives. So I think one important point is perhaps it's not helpful to think of climate investment in one big bucket, and we ought to start differentiating what we are talking about. I give you an example. We invested in the past, the GEF has been around for 30 years, as long as the Rio Conventions have been around from 1992. We did a lot of investment in large-scale wind. We kickstarted the market in Uruguay. We did a lot of investment in concentrated solar power in North Africa. We were instrumental for Morocco's success story. We don't do that anymore. We sort of have, in the last 2 cycles, meaning the last 6 years, 7 years, made a decision that the frontier of what is additionality is evolving, and we need to evolve with that. And so we decided that we no longer support large-scale grid-connected, utility-scale renewable energy. Some people might say, wait, how do you not do that in sub-Saharan Africa? Well, we believe that there's the majority of the market when it comes to solar and wind can already do it without too much of a subsidy. And the very scarce amount of funding that we have in terms of grant is better invested in areas where the energy transition is not working. I'm talking about energy efficiency, and I'm talking about electrification of 650 millions in sub-Saharan Africa, where they don't have basic access. So how have these evolved? Well, we always have to look at what is it that is already happening, and where we can make the most difference. One thing that I think is important for us is we are a climate and environmental fund. So what we are buying is emission reductions. So we have to look at how we maximize the abatement potential of each dollar. So together with everything related to financial innovation and supporting private sector, we have to remain sort of laser focused on where we have the most impact on the climate. And therefore, for us, the metric, instead of dollar mobilized, normally is emission or millions of emission reductions reduced for each dollar that we invest. Having said that, the going back to the leverage ratio, for our private sector investment, we have about 1 to 15, which I think is a pretty good one. And yes, but I think we have to break this concept of climate finance, and within that try to assign a sort of reasonable expectation of what the subsidy is needed in grant equivalent for each of the different subsectors. And when we do that, we'll see that it's a much more diverse landscape than we thought it was.
Thanks. And I'm going to turn the page a little bit now. We're going to start talking practicalities and examples so that the people that are here today in the audience and those that are listening in online can take things away and actually start implementing those. I think we're wrapping up the week here. We've all got heads full of knowledge, sore feet, as we said earlier. So we're going to hit the ground running. I'll ask Dan first, and then we'll pass over to Geraldine. And then please, anyone else on the panel here, feel free to jump in. What are the innovative structures and what are the key partnerships behind this? And how do we engage, this is a triple banger, triple question here. How do we engage the local domestic markets so we can really start leveraging in local currency for emerging markets in particular?
Thank you, Ben. There's so much to talk about. You could pick a zillion examples. I think Mark 1 this week that you all, or RMI Third Derivative, launched with Deep Science Ventures is a great example of something that's cutting edge, development as a service or developers as a service. I do think if you think about emerging markets in particular, someone said it, I think EJ, you said it, the new bright shiny object or even the old wine in a new bottle is a real risk, I think, to just getting this going at the pace and scale that's required, right? So a couple years ago, people started talking about jet Ps. Now they're not even implemented and we're talking about country platforms. Some people are now moving from blended finance to catalytic finance. What is that? Let's re-examine and understand what we all already are doing in slightly new terminology. So I think one of the things that is really exciting about, in particular, what Carla mentioned, is the domestic source of capital partnered with a set of international and or flexible pools of donor government capital as well as philanthropic. And that can be instantiated in a vehicle, a fund, a mechanism, a facility, a green bank. We at the Bezos Earth Fund are doing a lot of work to support through the Finance and Commons Summit and the International Development Finance Club with CPI, some work to stand up and support the development of green banks. And by the way, one thing just to say while I have the mic, the learning and the innovation goes both ways, right? So it's not the case that here domestically we figured it all out and now we're gonna tell the rest of the world how it's done. There's often a lot that's happening in Nigeria, in Kenya, in Bangladesh that can then be implemented here. And last thing, the GGRF money out of the Inflation Reduction Act is arguably the first big slug of blended finance that's meant to be deployed domestically. No one talks about it this way, but I think it's a learning that's come from the international development finance discourse and practice. And now we've got a lot of learning to do domestically here in the US to make sure that that money is spent well and to not spend 2 or 3 years replicating and failing to learn the lessons of the last 15, 20 years of what's been going on in the global south, where a lot of hard work has been done to figure this stuff out. So hopefully that's a couple little snippets of things that I think are new and innovative, and also really let's not try to reinvent the wheel yet again in 2025.
Just wanted to chime in, especially on the local currency point. I was reading some statistic from TCX that said that between 1919 and 2020, about 12.5% of currencies in emerging markets experienced a 20% depreciation annually. 5% actually experienced 50%. Now I'm from Nigeria, and I don't know if you've been following the markets in Nigeria, but the currency in the last 2 years went from 600 to $1 to 1,700 to $1. So in such an environment, it's actually quite usury to lend to these projects in foreign-denominated loans, especially when you're looking at long-term facilities. And there's a huge untapped source of local currency funding, and that's the pension funds. I mean, Nigeria has about $6 billion in pension funds that are untapped. There are obviously some regulatory issues that restrict deployment into infrastructure, but those can be addressed with credit enhancements, with some of the guarantee products that we've been talking about. And so that's an untapped source of local currency financing. And it's the same across several emerging markets. In South Africa, that number is closer to 150 billion. So there's really a pool of capital that can be deployed to support the energy transitions in these economies, and can use philanthropic capital to help unlock that.
Thanks. I'll pass it over to Geraldine. I just want to throw something else in there as well. So, I mean, what we've heard today, the private sector can deal with risks, right? But they can't deal with uncertainties. How should we be dealing with the uncertainties in emerging markets? The IRA has given the US those incentives. In particular, sort of bringing in catalytic finance to leverage more private capital in the market here in the US. What would you like to see in terms of innovation, in terms of the sort of policy environments in emerging markets? It's
How
a
long do we have? No, I mean, there are so many things that, you know, that there are, at Allied Climate Partners, we like to think about what we can do to change things and versus looking at all the risks, because then you will not do anything. But obviously, you know, Felipe, you mentioned it, a welcoming regulatory and government sort of environment is really important for these markets, especially because you're usually developing, you know, assets, and you need their consent and their approval and their desire to make things work. Currency obviously is a huge one as well, and understanding how to think about that, and obviously hedging, simple one, that's too expensive, so that's not scalable. So we've been thinking a lot at Allied Climate Partners about other sort of forms of sort of, you know, we like to unlock bottlenecks, but which, you know, what are the big ones? And if Allied Climate Partners is not the right one to address that sort of bottleneck or obstacle, then who can we partner with that can help us do that? Because at the end of the day, you know, we don't think we have all the answers, and we don't have all the time, but we want to partner with people locally and with other organizations to do that. Another thing that we haven't really talked about yet is talent. Talent is really important. We talk about local partners, but that is actually translates to people. And there are talent initiatives that we've actually also spun out of Three Karens around, you know, you have the money, you maybe have this investment vehicle, you may have the catalytic capital, but you have to have people to implement. And so sort of the talent initiative of matching the needs with the capabilities is another thing that we, you know, one of the other obstacles we found. Obviously, we're a philanthropic investment organization at Allied Climate Partners, and so what we like to do is seek partners to help us sort of solve those problems. So.
Absolutely, and we've certainly seen the way you've invested in those local partners with CCEF and others that you're exploring at the moment. And Carla, I think the lab really touches on that point specifically, really working with local developers, local partners. Maybe you could give us some examples that we heard from yesterday in the lab, some of those local organizations, financial institutions that have been established, which are dealing with local currency risks and the like.
Sure, yeah, there are several examples. I think that the first highlight I want to say is our approach to structuring and working with this organization is to the risk. There's, as you were saying, there is capital in the market, there is pipeline, but there's this perception that this pipeline is not investable, it's not attractive to the private sector, so we are really focused or concentrated in breaking those barriers to investment. And we use the word de-risking a lot, but we have different tools to the risk or break this risk perception. One is catalytic capital, but we have others like guarantees or insurance, which are now, I guess, the new tools that we have in the toolkit to use into these types of transactions. And the way we look into how to work with the local partners is to help them navigate the ecosystem and also try to break down these barriers. One example to Ben's question is the PIREC aggregation facility. This is an entity that provides upfront capital to project developers on the ground because they really struggle to have access to finance in fragile countries. So DRC, for example, or South Sudan. So they take the upfront risk and then they implement these projects and then monetizes the benefits, both the energy benefits, so environmental benefits and social benefits. And these are translated into a type of IREC that they have developed, which is called the Peace Renewable Energy Certificates. And these are aggregated into a fund and then sold to corporates. So corporates can take these offtakes and provide the funding necessary to cover the upfront funding provided before by the fund. So that's a way that different communities are working and getting together to implement the projects that they need in these countries, and then repay this with corporates that that provide the capital to finance this. So that's one of the examples. We have 71 examples, as I was saying, so we can talk a lot about this. But I guess one other thing is that we are also focused on opening new markets. So we try to go into sectors that are severely underfinanced relative to the impact they can deliver. So this is the approach we take, and that's why we try to partner with the organizations on the ground that know what are the challenges better than we can know sitting here.
Great. We're going to go into audience questions soon, and for the 100 or so plus of you listening in online, fill in the live question panel at the bottom of the screen. I'm going to pass just a quick fire round through everyone, just sort of summarizing, looking at sort of what's next, where innovations lie, and what your recommendations might be for the audience to take away, and then we'll go into quick questions. I'll start with you, Lippo.
Yeah, thanks. Very quickly, for me, and sort of tracing back to the point of how you get local partners, de-risking local financial institution is going to be one of the most important sort of areas for us. We recently have done an investment in a guarantee fund with a local development bank in South Africa, and the idea is sort of alleviating credit risk for local intermediary to finance SMEs that want to do energy efficiency upgrade. So we sort of like give a first loss guarantee of 30%, and then everything is above that, they assume, with some technical assistance to create capacity. So for me, financial intermediaries in developing markets are going to be the absolutely kind of fundamental piece of these. And the second part, something I'm very excited about, and I know Dan mentioned with some skepticism country platforms, but this element I've seen out of country platform now, there are national green banks that are being formed. One example is Fonerwa in Rwanda, and I know that this work is ongoing in other countries like Cote d'Ivoire, Benin, and that I think is a good way to bring together the public sector and the regulator and the private sector at country level in a way that the country is empowered to take both regulatory reform decisions, long-term planning, and financial investments.
Yeah, wonderful, and over to you. And maybe we can also just talk about, so one thing that's always on the top of my mind, and I've been hearing this week as well, is the need for standardization. But we can't just standardize without local context. We can't just copy-paste blended finance transactions, although, of course, they're always quite bespoke. Yeah, maybe we could talk a little bit to that, Jordan.
Yeah, so I mean, at ACP, we like to say that we want to be the friendly disruptor. So while I agree that, we don't want to create a new shiny object because we're all focused on scale and scaling. There we go. It helps to turn it on. So what I was saying is ACP really is focused on what we like to call being the friendly disruptor. So the friendly, obviously, part is that we recognize we need partners, but trying to disrupt things or trying to look at things slightly, sort of maybe orthogonally, is healthy sometimes. And that's exactly what we're trying to do in these markets where, yes, there have been sort of potentially other interventions, but the questioning of, is it the right intervention? Does it have the highest leverage? And so we're not shy in the concept of like partnering and designing. And the designing piece, we take a significant amount of time thinking through what that should look like to really be sort of minimally concessional so that, frankly, you use the least amount of catalytic capital so you can go do 3 or 4 more regions or 3 or 4 more sectors or 3 or 4 more areas, because it's sometimes too easy to just be like, oh, I need capital, and then you just sort of put capital, but that's not the highest leverage point. So for us, it's really around being that friendly disruptor, and like Clara said, like really knowing what's going on the ground, and it's going to be a different thing for different areas. And some of it's going to be early stage, maybe in other more developed markets like India, it may look a little different. But with the ultimate goal of scaling. And then with regards to your question on standardizations, I mean, that's sort of one of the things that the principles that we're trying to apply at Allied Climate Partners across the sectors, recognizing that maybe the pinpointing of what the need is different, but once you can you try to design it very similarly? So we're not trying to reinvent the wheel with CSEF and Climb. It's a fund. it looks like a fund, it's a 10-year life, you know, it has all the sort of it's not like it was, knowing that we were trying to crowd in, we were trying not to be innovative from that perspective. What we were trying to be innovative with was sort of how we structured the fund, and then hoping that that sort of structure of minimally concessional with a lot of leverage is something that we can replicate across. But always asking ourselves, is that appropriate?
Great. And keeping with that theme, how can we be friendly disruptors with minimum concessionality and the highest possible leverage from all of the experience that you have in the lab?
Yeah, that's a great question. We're still finding that out. But we think about catalytic, whether this is capital or whether like the leverage that we can provide to generate an impact in two ways. To repeat myself, like impact at a scale, right? So we're trying to balance this out with innovation in terms of like what can be as actionable that can deliver impact at a scale, and basically deliver these returns that you are talking about and bring in the private sector. And touching on the standardization point, it's very difficult to have a one-size-fits-all because you have to adapt to the local needs, to the local context, but it is very important to use different playbooks. See, use what has worked, what is working, and then take those components and apply it into different contexts. And then you will iterate from that, but as this panel has been talking about over the last hour or so, we don't need to reinvent the wheel, right? We need to just do things that have proven to work and try to act faster to scale these approaches. So yeah, I will let us with that takeaway.
Awesome. Can't emphasize the point to act faster any harder. Over to you, Dan.
I'm going to sort of just regurgitate something I've been hearing all week in lots of different contexts, but it's from first of a kind to second, third, fifth, nth of a kind. And I think we should think about that not just in the context of early stage technology demonstration and deployment and the TRL level 7 that the DOE is looking for with its support for a green steel plan or something. That's important. But we should think about that here and in the context of emerging markets and catalytic finance as well. So rather than bespoke 3 years to get to financial close, $200 million blended finance snowflake facility, let's think about platforms, including country platforms. I totally agree, and we're doing a lot of work to support green banks that can do this at scale and with counterparties that are already up and running with either balance sheet or the capacity to deliver on the ground and to do it again and again and again, because that's the only thing that I think is going to get us. We're halfway through the decisive decade. It's 2025 in 3 months, right? So let's not spend a year or two designing a perfect one-off. Let's try to do things that are nth of a kind across the range of interventions that we all know we need.
Yeah, plus one. Plus one to what Dan said. Look, I think just keeping to my initial theme around implementation, that's what I've been saying all week. How do we deploy more capital, and what are the real bottlenecks? And I do think that all of us on this panel, just thinking about it, are working collectively on implementation. So what ACP is doing is addressing a critical bottleneck around project pipelines. Like how do we have more project developers out there that can build the pipeline that the CFMs need to invest in, right? So in order to get to those $100 million ticket size investment that CFM is looking for, you need to spend $1 million on project preparation and development. And that's also what RMI works on, is how do we address that early stage project preparation risk so that we have more energy projects out there that are investable. And so I like the way that all of us are kind of collaboratively working on implementation. And that would be sort of my focus area.
Collaboratively working on implementation. I love that. I think it's a really good way to wrap that up. Now, whilst I'm gathering questions from online, to those of you who are online, please do fire them through. I would love to have an audience question. Do we have a roaming mic, please? No, we don't have a roaming mic. Over here. I'll repeat the question for those that are online. So quick and summarized.
Great panel, fantastic job.
Actually, I'm going to walk the mic over, sorry, if I can.
Is it long enough?
Well, you can come forward if you don't mind.
Scott Bryson from Orbital Farm and Impactful Capital. I think this was a fantastic panel. I want to level set. You know, we, according to McKinsey, we're $275 trillion by 2030, by 2050. So 35 years from now. The work that all of you are doing is really catalytic and fantastic. How is that being shared? And I think back to Dan's point and to your point earlier, this is this is the build shit fast moment, and it takes sharing these financial models and not the snowflakes. So how do we disseminate all of this fantastic knowledge in 10 years of lab work to everyone?
Yeah, I can start with that. So yeah, that's a great point. This is one of the reasons we partner with Convergence, because we realize that there's a lot of fragmentation in the ecosystem. We are all doing these things that are similar in some ways, but we need to share our experiences as well. So we launched a learning hub that is basically focused on sharing and disseminating this knowledge. So it was launched earlier this year, and the idea is to take lessons learned from the lab, but from Convergence's experience, from other partners' experience. So it's out there, and the goal is that we can prompt others to implement faster and take these experiences that have worked and implement it into their own projects.
So it's on your website, just to be clear?
Yes.
I'll just
Call us, email. We'll talk to anyone.
I'll say one quick thing. In my former life at Bloomberg, obviously it's a financial data company. I think the standardization, the disclosure, transparency across multiple dimensions. You could think about the net zero data public utility, or carbon markets data, or the GEMS database, which some of you know just this past year finally was made public so that people can see how these DFIs and MDBs operating in each country are actually dealing with this question of guarantees and catalytic capital recovery rates, to ultimately demonstrate to the market, the private sector, it's not as risky as you think, right? And here's the data to back that up. So I think to some degree, it's on the folks who can afford to, sometimes the more philanthropic or public entity parts of a deal, to demand, we want to be able to publish, what we're doing, right? And a lot of times the private fund managers are not incentivized in the same way to do that kind of sharing. But they can be made to share more by the participation of a public entity or a philanthropy.
Next question.
Thank you. Can you? I think it's working. Okay. Hong Patterson, thank you so much. I agree. It was a great panel, and I guess. And I also wanted to thank EJ for bringing up the local currency financing. I think that's such a hard nut to crack, and no one's been able to crack it yet. So it'll be really interesting to see how we can further invest into that. To that point, many of you talked about on the ground deployment and really working with local partners. And maybe the question is probably to Carla in terms of the work that you've been doing and looking at how disparate the sources of funding are for the local players. And I know you've been working on on complementarity and coherence, but this coherence is really urgent, not just with the multilateral players, not just with the international organizations, but also with the private players as well. And so maybe share a little bit of your thoughts around how platforms can not just be for the sources, but also for the end beneficiaries.
Yeah, that's a great question. So this goes back to the first point I was raising at the beginning of the ecosystem building approach. We need to bring everyone to the table. So through the local hubs, what we're trying to do is creating these networks of different types of actors, financiers, implementers, public institutions that can help with that. And on the other side of the spectrum, for the beneficiaries or the developers, they really understand what is the problem on the ground. So we do have an approach to try to leverage the IPLC focus, the community focus, to see how the benefits are translating into the end beneficiaries or the ultimate beneficiaries of these interventions. Because we're 2 levels away of that, but ultimately, if we build these ecosystems, we can have the general perspective of all these actors, and this is what we are trying to do right now with the Latin American lab that we just launched, following some of our experience in Brazil, in India, that have worked successfully, but now more in a regional level.
One last question.
Thank you. In the spirit of the authenticity in which you all shared your experiences, I have a question. I represent a social investors network out of Asia. This principle of minimum concessionality, it goes to the root of it, right? I worry about it. Do you ever worry that at the base of this, we are extending so many concessions? What is the concession that we are getting from the private sector? Just a few, investment, organizations here sit on like billions and billions in cash and not deploying it. And we are talking about market rates and making it investment ready and attractive. So what really can we do to actually, reform that and, actually embed some of the externality costs back into the private sector?
I can take some of it. We thought a lot about that. I think the one thing that for Allied Climate Partners in particular is we'll be minimally concessional, but we're pari passu on the upside. So if they're making money and once we've sort of returned capital, so will Allied Climate Partners and so will our partners. And that's really important to us, that we are there to sort of give downside protection, but not to potentially sort of give it away for free, if that makes sense. And so that's for us aligning that, and because that's, and I think some of the forms, the new like blended finance, a lot of people are just their first loss, and they just hope to get their capital back. But when you have the sort of the aligned incentives in a sense, that I think changes a little the conversation. And then the second piece, obviously, that we talked about is the intent of proving that actually the risk stack is not as risky as people believe. And then so for the next iteration, though not innovating a new vehicle, just changing the percentages. And so therefore sort of weaning the concessionality off. I know that takes time, and that doesn't answer potentially your direct question right now in terms of acting now. But we're hopeful that that is a very sort of effective way to sort of walk the horse to water. I don't know if there's anyone else.
Yeah, no, fully agree. And the idea is not subsidize the private sector, it's just to make the first move to generate a systemic change. So there is capital, as you were mentioning, but also a lot of institutional investors have fiduciary duties, so they need to be cautious about what new things they are investing on. And that's the role of concessional catalytic capital.
Great. Well, we're at time. Apologies to those in the audience whose questions we couldn't get to, but thank you so much to the panelists here. And can we get a massive round of applause for them, please? Thanks. An absolute honor not only to be sitting next to such talent, but those in the room as well who are out there doing the real work. We've heard today, obviously, that philanthropic capital and innovation are at the heart of mobilizing capital, particularly in emerging markets. However, leveraging capital effectively requires a balance, right? With practical, scalable solutions in addressing risks. And catalytic capital can't address all of those risks. Collaboration and local partnerships are also critical, to scale the leverage of capital, and local currency financing and local financial intermediaries are also going to play that role, mobilizing domestic capital, of course, for the transition. And last but not least, I think we need to see, financial sustainability. And whilst innovation is important, it doesn't need to be overly complex. Right? We've already got the examples we've heard up on the panel today. We can't just rinse and repeat. There needs to be contextualization of everything we do in all investments, and absolutely the engagement of local stakeholders in that to make sure that we have champions on the ground and there's a level of buy-in to make those investments successful. At the end of the day, we're working with the private sector and we need to deal with risks, but we need to remove any uncertainty in those markets. So without holding you up for any longer, we're just going to pause here for 10 minutes. We've got another awesome panel after this covering the Caribbean and a clean energy scenario. But in the meantime, thank you so much for those who have joined us today. Please take a pause for 10 minutes, bathroom break, whatever you need to do. The bathrooms are downstairs. There's coffee and food up in the corner. And please do come over and accost the panelists if you have any pressing questions. And we'll see you back here in 10 minutes at 10:40 sharp.
Hi there. If you could please make your way back to your seats, we will start the second session momentarily. If you could please make your way back to your seats, we will start the next session momentarily. Thank you.
I'm not moderating, but I'm sort of bringing people up. Okay, great. Yeah. Sorry, everyone. Can we all start taking our seats again, please? Unfortunately, we've got a tight schedule to stick to. So please, if you could return to your seats. All right, everyone. Last person to sit down owes everybody a beer. It's been a long week. It's a little bit of a competition now. So can we all please take our seats? I know the networking is important. We'll have plenty of time after the next panel. Okay. Everyone, please take your seats. We're about to, we are already live again. Yes, please do. Reconnect again. Where are you? Amsterdam. Oh, yes, that's right. Of course. Wow. Safe travels back. Okay, unfortunately we're at time. We're going to have to kick off whether you're sitting down or not, and remember the last person to sit down. Shh. Wow, that worked so much better. Just raise your hand. All right, welcome back. Welcome back, everyone. We're now shifting gears into the second part of our Catalytic Climate Capital Forum. For those of you who are just tuning in, we just had an amazing panel on catalytic climate capital and those that are dispersing resources and using them and leveraging private capital. We'll be hearing in this next panel from an expert panel moderated by Raquel Moses of the Caribbean Climate Smart Accelerator. It's going to feature leaders and experts in the region, many of them good friends. But first, some important context setting. We need this context setting to understand the issues at hand and what these small islands are facing. We'll hear from first Gianni Scianetta. Am I pronouncing that correct? Yeah. Founder of Greening the Islands Forum. He's going to be speaking to creating a transition roadmap. And then we'll also hear from my colleague Skylar B., who's standing in today for our other colleague David Gums. Skylar is a portfolio manager at the RMI Islands Energy Program. And she will present an exclusive preview of our Caribbean transition scenario that is going to be launched in full next year. Gianni, welcome.
Good morning, everyone. I know there was an amazing panel before talking about grants, of course, and which are important to kick off, of course, the investment in the islands. But a message, anyway, I'd like to give that, of course, grants are important to start, but then if you want to make it a change, we need to mobilize the private sector so much from any kind, from solution providers, private investors, etc., and we need to find a way. And let me say also that the technology is there, is mature, and so there is something else that work a bit less, we need to make it work. We are working already from 10 years on dealing with islands, on energy, water, mobility, waste, but energy has been our main focus. And I have some outcome from an initiative that we started in New York last year, which is so-called the 100% Renewables Islands Initiative, with a partnership of UNDESA and Global Renewable Alliance. But of course, RMI now is a strategic partner together with Blue Planet Alliance and many others. So some key points before giving some flavors about the initiative. Indeed, is the governance is very important. In the island, we discovered that there is not coordination between even departments, even inside the governments. They are receiving money, grants, etc., and everybody make his own program, pilot, etc., without talking with other departments. We need a coordination. We need a commissioner, really, for the energy transition, and ideally also for sustainability at all, because energy is not driving alone. We need to connect with the other sector, and we need a steering committee. We need a single point of accountability really to take care about, coordinate all the efforts, all the policy, because even policy don't talk each other. So we need also a commissioner driving a multi-stakeholder committee with individual body people from the different departments. Policy regulation is the key bottleneck. It's not technology. It's there. It's really important. We need to phase out of fossil fuel subsidies. The utilities are not motivated to make the change because they are compensated for whatever they spend. Anyway, so why they should do the change? Let's talk clearly. The regulation has been, maybe because of the, let's say, advocacy of the oil company, has been copied and pasted from the Philippines to Indonesia to Caribbean, etc. The utility is compensated in most cases, And so there is no motivation. Instead, the utility should be incentivized to be the first mover to invest in the renewables. There is a great opportunity for the long run. Of course, you need planning, a strategy, permitting. We launched a few days ago in our event in the Commonwealth building with UNDESA the joint recommendation with the Global Renewable Alliance about permitting. Permitting costs even 15-20% of the total. Regulatory energy community engage the communities, and of course we need to create capabilities. Infrastructure, modernization of the grid, nexus with other area, because if we want to electrify with renewables all the sectors, we need to already think about a concept of grid that already foreseen that. Maintenance, quality, and indeed we need to integrate the energy plan with the risk mitigation plan, especially we're talking the Caribbean with all the disaster, etc. And on financing, we need to break the wall between private investment and public investment. We need to build the trust using really transparency procedures that allow that, and indeed encouraging private investment, EPP, through PPA agreement. And indeed, one important point is engaging the local community since the beginning and the local industry to be an actor. Very quickly, this is the 100% renewables initiative with all our partners. We started with Curaçao, Rodriguez, Tonga, but already announced Rhodos, for instance, in Greece to join us. We are targeting seeds and sub-nation islands because altogether, all islands count more than 1 terawatt, can contribute to the global target if we consider onshore and offshore. So we are trying to push this concept to investors. That is a great opportunity. So in our process, we have phase 1 where we build the scenarios how to really the island can go 100% renewables. Of course, we need to have a workshop engaging all the community, utility, etc., and select the best scenario, and then define a real roadmap, so planning and where to make this roadmap, in which places, etc., which dimension. Building an island project is a map. And the last, just about some data about Curaçao. We are going to have a workshop on the 10-11 of October. Anyway, Curaçao can go much faster to 100% renewables. Already 2030 by already 85% by 2030 with the existing technology, while it can reach very easily even 100% by 2035 with an investment just a year for investors. 300 million euro is a huge number, important number, attractive for investor. If you consider also the storage, we're talking about 360 megawatt hour. And so we are talking about an island of less than 200,000 people. So you can imagine how big can be the opportunity if you put islands together in the region for technology, etc., and what we are trying to build with RMI, with the key partner to build a pipeline of projects worldwide that can be really attractive for investment. But this money are, of course, interesting, but this would cause us huge saving. The other, the Intersolar, the Minister of Energy of Curaçao, when saw this number, said this is what we spend in a few years, in reality, with oil. So, interesting, but already are spent for fossil fuel. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Gianni. Skylar.
Thank you, Ben. Can everyone hear me? Perfect. I'm going to use the podium because I have some notes. But thank you, everyone. I'm Skylar B. I'm a portfolio manager at the Islands Energy Program at RMI. There we go. I'm filling in for David Gums today, who's our director of the Islands Energy Program. Unfortunately, he couldn't be with us in person because he's taken ill, but he's with us on the live stream. And I think, we're here today to present, and if we can move to the next slide. There we go. A Caribbean transition scenario that RMI is currently working on and building out. And really, I think Gianni has set the scene very nicely with his presentation, kind of on the ingredients that constitute a transition roadmap, and the different things that need to take place. I hope by the end of this presentation I can kind of take that a little bit full circle. And I wanted to follow up here by digging in a step deeper and spotlighting 4 Caribbean use cases, Barbados, Dominica, Grenada, and Jamaica, to really demonstrate opportunities for different transition pathways within the region. There is no one fixed pathway that a country can take. It's going to look different depending on each of the national contexts, but there are still some common lessons learned that we can pull out of these transition pathways to kind of build into an optimal approach for the region. And as I said, this is building on work RMI has done towards producing a regional transition scenario, which we're aiming to launch next year at the SE for All Global Forum in Bridgetown. So to just dive right in, the first case we wanted to present and kind of highlight is Barbados. And I think, everyone in the room is probably aware that Barbados has been a climate champion and has set one of the most ambitious renewable energy targets in the region, really aiming to achieve 100% renewable energy penetration by 2030. And government leadership in setting such ambitious targets, backing them up with supportive policies, has been a really key and enabling factor in driving the transition in Barbados, and we'll similarly see that with other countries that we touch on today. But what makes Barbados a really interesting use case, and one of the reasons we wanted to highlight it, is because of its commitment to decentralize and democratize the energy transition. And they've even codified this, in policy and programming through their right to renewable energy policy, and putting very strong regulatory measures in place to back up this aim to decentralize their generation. And this has really incentivized very, very rapid uptake in Barbados. To kind of drive that home, and one of the points we have here is that of the installed capacity in Barbados, nearly 90% of it is coming from decentralized sources. It's quite incredible. Our team was on the ground in Bridgetown in July, and it is very hard to find a rooftop that does not have solar on it. It's very apparent, that this is working. However, rapid deployment of renewable energy doesn't come without its challenges, and the kind of rapid uptake has led to some grid stability issues, and it's required the regulator to actually put a temporary hold on all new RE interconnections. So, we're kind of seeing a challenge here in terms of being able to fully implement the transition. And currently, over 300 distributed PV licenses are kind of stuck on hold in the queue. This obviously has implications for Barbados' ability to, meet its 100% renewable energy target by 2030, but it also, also these delays risk bankruptcy to developers and investors. So it's really quite an urgent problem to tackle. And in order to tackle this problem and looking at the enabling factors, one of the things that what has come out clearly from our consultations has been the complexity of the national energy landscape in Barbados. Is really unlocking that is the key to unlocking the queue and getting all of this back online. There's a kind of a consensus, and I think it's not just the case for Barbados, but also across the region, that technical challenges are not necessarily what's holding us back. What's holding us back, is the result. It's important, and grid integration is important, but really what's holding us back is, the need for more alignment between the key stakeholders in terms of the governments, the utilities, the regulators, as well as the general public to support these policies. To follow up Barbados, we also wanted to kind of dig into Dominica. It's a very different use case from a lot of what we're seeing in the region. Like Barbados, Dominica aims to achieve 100% generation from renewable energy by 2030 as well, so also really kind of leading on that front. But we wanted to highlight Dominica because it's a great example of a country that's meeting its transition goals by proactively leveraging its natural resources and diversifying its energy mix. So with a focus on geothermal, hydro, solar, battery storage solutions. And really here we want to focus on kind of the geothermal aspects. But this kind of diversification of its energy mix, allows Dominica to, one, drive long-term environmental and economic sustainability, two, eventually, realize cost reductions through the introduction of these new technologies, and three, enhance climate resilience. So you can see here, and it might be a little hard to see on the screen, but Dominica has a geothermal resource capacity of nearly 1,400 megawatts. And it's literally, when you compare it to the other sources, kind of off the charts. We couldn't actually accurately represent it here. And it's in the first stages of really kind of realizing this potential. What they can supply will far exceed the local demands. And they're in the first stages of kind of developing and putting in place a 10 megawatt geothermal power plants to realize their local demands, but they also have ambitions to scale beyond that. One of the challenges here is that projects like geothermal have a longer project preparation timeline. They also have a higher risk to production. And Dominica has encountered, some delays in terms of natural disasters, financing challenges that have slowed progress, on this front in the last decade. However, Dominica is proceeding, with a 10 megawatt plant. They're actively, applying lessons learned on a smaller scale with the goal to eventually, invest in innovation and ambition, and in terms of leveraging these resources in the long term, to ultimately harness this geothermal capacity to support a green hydrogen industrial development program for eventual export. So they're really, they're starting small, but they're really planning to scale up quite big in the future with the resources they have. The third case we wanted to present was Grenada. Grenada is also aiming for 100% renewable energy use by 2030. I hope you're sensing a theme here. In terms of, how our small island states are really kind of punching above their weight, pushing ahead of the curve in terms of leading on ambition for climate targets. But in Grenada, with the utility, the regulatory body, and the public, they're all very well aligned on renewable energy initiatives. This is a great example of where all of the stakeholder alignment has come in place and is starting to actively able changing quite rapidly. And this alignment has been heavily driven, by government leadership, particularly at the Prime Minister level, as well as from the Ministry of Renewable Energy. And it's a really timely case because, as we sit here and as we speak, Grenada is really moving rapidly on its largest solar PV project to date. It's prioritized and aggregated 21 megawatts of solar PV and 12 megawatts of battery storage to be spread out across 4 major sites in the country. And it's really going to act as kind of a flagship for Grenada, but also within the region. And to enable this, Grenada is taking a top-down, really aggregated and large-scale project approach to create a long-term pipeline of renewable energy projects. And this approach really, I think what we want to drive home, ensures that these ready-to-implement additional projects are going to be in place when the financing becomes available for them. So they're really creating a pipeline with the aim to open up the market for investors to inevitably step in. So they're moving in the short term, and they're also planning for the medium to long term. And as we note here, on the slide, and as we were hearing from our panelists earlier today, financing is obviously going to be a key factor to enabling Grenada's transition. This is true for all of the island nations. And to secure funding for project implementation, Grenada is actively looking at partnering, with both multilateral and development agencies for that catalytic finance piece, but as well as the establishment of public-private partnerships with the intention of leveraging independent power producers and setting up IPPs in the future. And the final case, because I'm pretty sure I'm running over time, is Jamaica. And Jamaica is actively working towards a goal of 50% renewable energy by 2030. And I think due to its size, the energy mix, the number of stakeholders, it's probably one of the more complex transition cases that we have in our study and also in the region. But what's really notable about Jamaica and what we wanted to highlight is its use of independent power producers and how it's really been able to build up a market around that. And it's an example of a country where it started its transition planning very early. It had well-planned foundational policies and regulations in place that were really able to effectively set up the use of public-private partnerships and IPPs. This in turn attracted private investment, which has allowed for the development of several successful large-scale renewable projects. With Jamaica, despite having a very well-established energy sector, the pace of the transition has begun to slow. And I think this is something that's important to note. So for example, Jamaica has its integrated resource plan that calls for 260 megawatts of renewable energy generation, and they're currently actively procuring for 100 megawatts of this, but this procurement process has been under evaluation for several years at this point. It's kind of stretching on. And so these kinds of delays, highlight the need for efficient regulatory processes that are, continually negotiated and updated, and the importance, as we keep kind of touching on, of that stakeholder alignment as the transition kind of begins to advance in each of these countries and as the energy landscape begins to shift. So with that, I have my final slide, which, we've kind of looked at these 4 cases. We've looked at, the kind of setup, the use case, the enabling factors, the challenges, and what are the kind of key takeaways here that we can be looking at for what would help enable a regional transition. And we have 5 of them, and I'll move through them quickly. But the first, which I think, we particularly note with the likes of Barbados, with Grenada, is government leadership, is essential and can be very key in accelerating the energy transition, and really kind of setting those targets and pushing them forward and, kind of bringing all of the stakeholders along with them. That being said, one of the things that's come out clearly as we've been talking to stakeholders in the region is that policy also can't happen in a vacuum. We can't set a target that's unreachable, and so making sure that these targets are set with, the proper, policy and planning frameworks in place are equally important. The second that we wanted to touch on is obviously strong regulatory frameworks. The regulators kind of look at the targets and kind of follow suit in terms of the frameworks that they put in place. And putting in place frameworks, having accurate feed-in tariffs, things like Barbados' right to renewable energy, enabling the uptake of RE is really quite important and is into driving the energy transition in each. The third, as I've touched on multiple times, is stakeholder alignment is key. As I said before, a lot of the challenges aren't necessarily technical. Sometimes they are, but the technology is in place. It's ready to be implemented and used. It needs to be planned properly for. But that planning process, requires alignment of all of the relevant stakeholders in countries. So government, utility, regulator, and bringing the general public along with that as well. The fourth is resilience. It's something that we love to talk about all the time here at RMI when we talk about the energy transition, is that, energy security is resilience. Without energy security, we don't have resilience. And so being able to recognize that, fundamentally transitioning to renewables, to exploring technologies like microgrids, to decentralizing, these are all acts of resilience. And ensuring that this is built in to the transition, and the transition narrative is very important. And then finally, financing, which is what we've been talking about all morning, and we'll definitely continue to talk about as we move into our panel. But financing is going to be the key to moving the transition forward. I think we wanted to recognize that we're kind of at a state in the transition where the inevitable next step is going to be figuring out this financing piece. And as we heard from our panelists, EJ today said implementation is not just a promise you make at COP. It's something that you actually have to make happen, and financing is kind of the key piece to that. And so really understanding the financing pathways and instruments and mechanisms that are going to be regionally appropriate, and where we can tap into things like catalytic capital to facilitate that and catalyze these projects is going to be very important. So with that, I do believe I'm probably a little bit over time. So thank you so much, and we'll move into our panel. And I'm really happy to welcome Ms. Raquel Moses to the stage. She's the CEO of the Caribbean Climate Smart Accelerator and will be our moderator today, followed by Dr. Jimmy Fletcher, Managing Director of Solora Khan, and then and then Ms. Charlene Bodley, who is the Associate Director of Energy and Innovation at the Bezos Earth Fund, and finally, Mr. Rodinald Sumer, CEO of the CARICOM Development Fund.
Good morning and welcome. We're from it's a Caribbean session, yes. We do call and response, you're supposed to respond. All right. Happy Julian Alfred Day. Who knows what that is? Yeah, woo! That's right. And I have some St. Lucia pins in case you want to celebrate. Ah! I didn't even realize that. No way. This is really a way to celebrate National Julian Alfred Day.
3 solutions on the back.
That is phenomenal. Oh, yes.
Julian Alfred is the world's fastest woman. She won the 100 meters at the Olympics and she came second in the 200. And today, St. Lucia has given a public holiday and we're all celebrating Julian Alfred, our sprint queen. And you have 3 solutions on the back.
This is Caribbean excellence. Yeah. And to know that we do more, we do more than just Olympics, and we're now in an energy sprint, right? So we're going to talk about how we get there. Okay, so the regional, and thank you so much, Skylar. That was a really, really great context setting for where we are and what we're doing. And as you can see, climate targets and renewable energy targets have been set by the region, and many of them are incredibly aggressive. And I think most of the islands have punched well above their weight in terms of what they want to achieve because they understand that our survival depends upon it. So I'm going to go to Dr. Fletcher first. But beyond climate, it's important that these targets are aligned with economic, social, and market growth for the region. How can regional climate targets be achieved and or updated, because we know the updated NDCs are due next year, and that is also a race. Jamaica is trying to be first, and I know some other islands are swiftly getting theirs together. How do we factor in the need for socioeconomic development, and what are some of the key factors to consider?
Thank you, Thank you, Raquel. Thanks, and good morning, everyone. For us in the Caribbean, although we all set energy targets and emission reduction targets in our NDCs, our nationally determined contributions, which are the things that every single country that is a party to the Paris Agreement on climate change, for us, the energy transition is actually more about economics and social equity than it is about the environment, for the very, very simple reason. We are minuscule contributors to the world inventory of greenhouse gases. My country, St. Lucia, contributes, I think, 0.008% of the total inventory of greenhouse gases. The Caribbean, in total, even factoring in Trinidad and Guyana, which is now becoming a major player, is still less than 0.2% of world greenhouse gas emissions. However, in all of our countries, except Trinidad and Tobago, we pay an exorbitant price for electricity. So St. Lucia, the price of electricity runs somewhere around 40 US cents per kilowatt hour. So we can't have any kind of market competitiveness with that price. Almost all of the sectors that we depend on, agriculture, value added in agriculture, tourism, which is a big one for us, depend on energy as an input. So when you're paying 40 US cents per kilowatt hour, you can't be competitive. So for us, the driving factor behind the energy transition is economics. It is removing that exposure that we have to volatility in the world oil markets, which we have every time there's conflict in the Middle East, every time there's a disruption to supply chains, we are affected. So that's why we've been pursuing this with some level of aggression, and that's why you see these very aggressive energy targets. They have 100%, 50%, etc. So we've already done that translation to economic factors. The other thing too is that we understand the need for social equity, and I know it's a point that we'll probably get into a little bit later on in the discussion, but we have to ensure that as we move along this energy transition, that we do not create a new class of energy poverty. So it's very important in this energy transition to ensure that nobody is left behind. One of the challenges that I had in the previous life as St. Lucia's Minister for Energy and Climate Change was that the people who came to me very aggressively wanting to move away from the grid, wanting to deploy renewable energy, were the hotels, were the big manufacturers. Unfortunately, these are the people who pay more for electricity. So when you allow them to come off the grid, then you balance the whole electricity tariff structure, and the cost of transmission and distribution then has to be passed on to the poorer people, the people who can't afford to put solar panels on their rooftops. So you have to be very careful how you manage that transition so that you do not create a situation where those who can afford will move off the grid, and those who can't afford then bear the cost of the grid. So for us, that's extremely important, and that's where the equity portion comes in. But the other thing where this really creates an exciting opportunity is for workforce development. You know, we are moving towards a green economy. And I know today we're only speaking about our energy targets, but our climate targets are about more than energy. They're about water, they're about agriculture. All of them designed to show how we can make our countries more resilient to the impacts of climate change. How can we usher in a new green economy that will excite young people who really don't want to go into the drudgery of field agriculture, but can see some excitement in moving into renewable energy. One of the things I know that, and I won't steal Charlene's thunder because I know Charlene will talk about it in a lot more detail, but we always, when we speak of energy, we automatically gravitate towards the electricity sector. But in the Caribbean, the transport sector uses up almost 50% of fossil fuels. So there's a big opportunity there that we're not even looking at. And again, there's a possibility there with the greening of the transport sector for new forms of economic opportunity to open up. Can you imagine, I mean, right now, the people who run stations, fuel stations, are the people who are franchised by Sol and by Rubis. But if you now have a transport sector that is comprised mostly of electric vehicles, what is stopping you from setting up your own commercial charging station? Powered by solar or whatever, could be a combination of solar and fossil fuels, but you can now position yourself as a charging station. It doesn't have to be any one of the established people. So there are many opportunities there that we are focusing on. However, there is quite a bit of work that still has to be done. Regulations have to be addressed. In not all of our countries do we have independent arm's length regulators. If you look at the energy report cards, that another one of the hats that I wear as chairman of the executive board of the Caribbean Center for Renewable Energy and Energy Efficiency, we put out these energy report cards every year. And if you look at the regulatory apparatus, the institutional architecture for regulation in the Caribbean, you'll see that some countries have independent arm's length regulators, some don't. In some countries, actually, the regulator is listed as the cabinet. I don't know that there's any investor that will take any comfort in the cabinet being the regulator, but the cabinet is the regulator in some countries. You have antiquated electricity supply acts that still give inordinate control to the incumbent utility. And again, that does not provide the type of conducive environment for independent power producers to come in. So there are things that have to be addressed. There's the question of political will. Everything that is happening in Barbados right now is because Prime Minister Mia Mottley has said that wind and sun are God-given rights and nobody should be regulating it, or you should not have to be applying for that. So you've seen RE in Barbados just take off. I mean, where Barbados was not a leader before, Barbados has become a leader overnight just because of Mia Mottley. In some of our other countries, we've seen the exact opposite. We've seen when regimes change, and I won't talk about that because I'm kind of implicated in this, but when regimes change, then the whole appetite for renewable energy changes, and the new government that comes in doesn't see that as a priority. And that, for me, is one of the most baffling things about the Caribbean. Because when you have an economy that is being driven by fossil fuels, and you're paying so much for fossil fuels, I don't understand why our governments have not embraced this energy transition more than they have. And maybe the reason is, the only thing I can come up with is the long gestation period. That the average energy project has a gestation period that is more than 5 years. 5 years is a very important period in the life cycle of a government in the Caribbean. If you're not able to bring a project from start to finish in 5 years, it means that you don't have anything to boast about when an election comes around, and you're much better off focusing on something that will bring you a quick win. And I believe that might be one of the reasons we are not seeing that aggression towards renewable energy, because one, the ability to mobilize finance takes too long. The ability to develop projects, again, is beyond our capacity. I don't think we've developed that capacity sufficiently. And then finally, the ability to take that project from, Dominica has been working on geothermal for a long time. Yeah. You know, decades. Same thing with St. Lucia. Yeah. Every single island. We started a wind farm project in St. Lucia, and that died. So that might be one of the issues. But yes, we have to translate those climate targets into targets that mean something to people, where workforce development is concerned, where resilience is concerned. I mean, we have to factor in resilience because we're impacted by hurricanes every single year, and it's getting worse. So that's my opening salvo where that's concerned.
Wonderful, and thank you so much. So, Charlene, I'll go to you, and I'll get informal now and start calling everybody by their first names. Huh? Thank you. So, you know, the question of equity is really important, and I know you speak eloquently about this often, but I want to ask you about equity in two different ways. One, about equitable access to power, but also equitable access to the investments in this transition, because I think it's really important that we own our future.
Good morning, a pleasure to be here, and luckily Dr. Fletcher has started off the conversation for me. Fun fact, I entered the energy sector working with the first energy unit of St. Lucia under the leadership of Dr. Fletcher. So it's such an honor to be here this morning with him. You know, this topic of equity, and I'm going to start with equity in terms of access, and speaking of energy resources, but I also wanted to speak of energy services. And I think for me, if I had to take an approach where I have a hierarchy of what I think is the most important or what follows through from the other, I would say policy. And we're hearing of the examples. We have the shiny case of Barbados that has basically understood the democracy around accessing renewable energy resources with the household right to renewable energy policy that opens up to 10 kilowatts for each household without requiring a license. And that is astronomical in terms of the progress that we've made in the Caribbean. I think with that though, and the next important point for me would be regulation. And I think, we say you build the plane while flying it, and that is true. I am a terrified flyer, so that phrase never sits well with me. We build a plane while flying it, but at the same time, I think there are certain things we want to get right before that plane takes off. And it's finding a sweet spot, because what happens is when you have an island that takes off as a leader, if it doesn't work, the other islands literally slow down and they start moving backward, like, okay, this hasn't worked in Barbados, we're not going there. We don't have time. It's as simple as that. We don't have time. In our case, it's really about economic prosperity, as you've heard. And so I think the regulatory environment needs to be urgently strengthened. We talk about it year after year, but it's something we have to continue reiterating. And I think of maybe another positive example on the regulatory side. I think Jamaica has done well. But I think about Bermuda, and they have made significant strides because of such a robust, transparent, and effective regulatory environment that has really enabled that transition, but has enabled every segment of the population to access energy services and resources. Now, we speak a lot about the electricity sector, but the transport sector is something very dear to my heart. St. Lucia, for instance, 63% of our energy consumption is from our transport sector. And that is mind-blowing, but our focus is on electricity. How do we ensure that we're transitioning in a way and ensuring that there is participation by the population? So Bermuda, as well as Barbados though, but Bermuda for me stands out in terms of that transition of the transport sector, as their route has been, yes, allowing or having incentives for private vehicle owners, but the public transport system is electrified, with close to 100, I believe, electric buses on the, so that provides that service to the average Joe and Jane that may not have access to a privately owned vehicle. Dr. Fletcher touched on capacity, and it would be remiss of me not to mention it. In my role at RMI as manager of the Energy Transition Academy. And I think about, and to be fair, most of the region has access to electricity, and that is in large due to a national grid. So I don't think we have that challenge in terms of accessing electricity. We do have some exceptions. We have Haiti, and we cannot leave out Haiti in a discussion around the Caribbean with less than 25% access to electricity. We have Guyana, Belize, Suriname with hinterland and rural areas that don't have access. And as we think about rural electrification, one thing that stands out to me is we add in a 1% investment for capacity building as these projects are rolled out. And what happens is, imagine a hinterland project and something goes wrong or there is a disaster and that system is down for a while, then the time that the population within that community is without access is extended because you don't have the local capacity to recover. And so I think we need more investment, a more holistic approach to building capacity. And on the funding side, I remember reading an IEA report that quoted that 900 billion US dollars has been channeled through global governments. So this is not a Caribbean focused data point, but through global governments for reducing consumer prices in light of the energy crisis. Also mind-blowing though is only 1/4 of that funding was channeled to lower income populations. And I think that there says it. We need to, when we speak of financing, and yes, the technologies are wonderful, we think of megawatt power, but we also need to think of human power and ensuring that everyone has equal access. Maybe just 2 more points. One on, making these customer-sited renewable energy projects possible, like in the case of Barbados. But we also have to now think, and Dr. Fletcher mentioned the hoteliers, so even in terms of small businesses, do they have equal access to an affordable resource? And then we think about the entire population in terms of the cost of the grid upgrades that are necessary to permit that higher penetration of variable renewable energy. Are the lower income ones also bearing that cost of these grid upgrades? And already they don't have the income to be able to implement renewable energy resource. And the last point, as one of 2 women on the panel, gender is a topic that we, again, speak of on the sidelines, but understanding the varying needs of your population must make its way into the design of your projects, into the design of policies, and not an afterthought. So one thing is women in their traditional roles in households, their work is unmeasured, underreported, and so if we have an inequity in how we measure the work of men, then technology innovation, business models in innovation is going to favor ways and means of making men's work easier. And so it is my hope that one day these conversations become obsolete.
Absolutely, and thank you so much, Charlotte. All right, Rodnall. So what is the role of catalytic capital, and what is CDF doing to ensure that we are able to address some of these challenges?
Thank you, Raquel. Well, my fellow panelists have sort of set the stage, the backdrop for some of what I would say. And there was a session a while ago on catalytic capital. We don't have much of an experience in the region in leveraging or attracting catalytic capital to in our financing models for any sector. And what the CDF has done recently is that we have invested in a new fund, which I think may have been mentioned at the last panel, a resilience fund, Caribbean Community Resilience Fund, which the CDF seeded with first loss capital to basically attract other investors into the space. And we found that this has been a game changer for us because we have a mandate in CARICOM to stimulate greater investment in growth and resilience. So on the resilience side, we're focusing on broader economic resilience, but also a stream of effort targeted towards building climate resilience. So within that framework, we said, okay, we needed to do something innovative using the capital that is provided to us by the member states to establish the fund. So we allocated $15 million US as first loss in this fund, and we've been able to attract other investors in that first loss tranche to anchor the fund and to start attracting commercial capital. The fund has an initial target of $100 million US, but while I don't want to speak too soon, all indications suggest that we may be closing at somewhere around 135 million. And that's because of the traction that we've been getting. We have a couple of partners, one of which is in the room. I don't know if I should mention. I'm not in a position yet because I think the due diligence process is still ongoing. But one I can probably mention, which is just illustrative for sure, is IDB Invest. So IDB Invest is one of the anchor investors in this. And I believe the other investor will be making an announcement soon. And I'm able to say this because, as we said, there's a long gestation period for these processes, but they have gone through their due diligence and have committed 2 streams of financing for the fund. What this will allow us to do is to achieve a first close by the end of November at between 40 to 50 million. And what we're going to do, we already have projects in the pipeline that we can deploy so that we can create that demonstration effect. Many of these projects are actually in the renewable energy space, which is probably why I'm sitting up here. And it's important to note that because this is a private sector fund, and we need to be able to finance projects that generate a commercial return for the investors. And renewable energy provides, a wide field of opportunities in that regard. The sectors that are targeted, although we say the fund is sector agnostic, based on the opportunities that have emerged and based on the analysis that we've done in the market, renewable energy frontally is one, certainly blue economy, sustainable housing, and climate-smart agriculture. So there are obviously strong renewable energy connections across all of these sectors. Where you're going more broadly to cover other sectors on the economic resilience side, transport being one of them, critically. So this is what we've been doing. We've basically taken a step that I don't think any other regional entity has done. And it's important to note, as my colleagues have said, that this is really driven by the political leadership. Because the way that we are structured, the CDF falls under the CARICOM Single Market and Economy, and the lead Prime Minister in CARICOM for the CSME is Prime Minister Mia Mottley. So she put this challenge out to us, and we said, okay, there's only one way we could do this. We need to be innovative, and we need to invest in this new facility, which is what incentivized us to go to our board and say, hey, we need to put 15 million US of our limited resources to get this going. So this is where we're at. This is what we're doing. And in fact, what we have found is that, I know we're going to come to lessons learned a little later. What we're already starting to realize is that once you put something out in the market that addresses the deficiencies, that could draw out the demand, then you start seeing things that you didn't realize existed. You get a lot of projects basically coming out of the woodwork, but among those, there are a number of projects that need further development. So what we also did, to directly respond to your question, is we also introduced into this fund a technical assistance sidecar that is focused on project development right through the cycle, not just preparation and design, but also support to implementation and impact measurement, because we need to be able to demonstrate impact, because some of the investors are impact investors, and they need to be able to say, this is what we've achieved. And of course, in investment now, I think it's fair to say that there's a little bit of impact investor in all of us, and impact really matters.
All right. Brilliant, and thank you so much. So based on the schedule and the time, we are at time, and I'm supposed to open up for questions, which, right. So thanks, I've decided what I'm going to do. I've got the mic. Yes, so what I'm going to do one last round of final thoughts to make sure that they all get a chance to at least add, and I'm going to use part of your Q&A time for that, if that's all right. You with me? Remember, Caribbean, call and response, you with me? All right. So we're going to start with Jimmy to give us some final thoughts so that we can close out the conversation.
Thanks, Raquel. The energy transition is extremely important for us in the Caribbean. So I think there's certain things that we have to pay attention to. One of them is getting that regulatory apparatus right. That is absolutely important. And when I speak of the regulatory apparatus, I'm not just speaking about the regulator, but I'm also speaking about the legislation, because we have antiquated legislation in some instances. For example, in my country, St. Lucia, we're working on a 1965 Electricity Supply Act that gives an 8-year monopoly to the incumbent utility for generation, transmission, and distribution. One of my last acts as a minister was to remove the monopoly for generation so that at least we can have competition from independent power producers, but it still means that the utility is front and center of a lot of things that happen, and that constrains what we're able to do. Second thing is capacity development. We've been fortunate, when again, during my stint, we partnered with people like RMI, with Clinton Climate Initiative, with Carbon War Room, Richard Branson's Carbon War Room, and that gave us the kind of footing that was able to help Charlene, who had just come in, and this is what, 12 years ago, and Charlene's growth in that period has been monumental. I mean, it's amazing. But Charlene and others really find their feet and now become the trailblazers that they are. The third area that I think we have to look at is this whole question of just transition. We have to ensure that we do not leave people behind. I'm very worried that the energy transition, as I said earlier, will not just create a new class of energy poverty, but we're also now changing the structure of the energy governance in the Caribbean. In all of our countries, the electricity sector is owned, operated, and managed primarily by locals. When you now allow independent power producers to come in, many of these independent power producers are not Caribbean independent power producers. And you run the risk of now disrupting. Now, it's not that foreign direct investment is not good. We welcome foreign direct investment in every area. But we have to be careful that we do not now change the structure of our energy system, be in our haste to now bring in independent power producers, and we create conditions that allow our own Caribbean people to be able to invest, particularly Caribbean people who live in the diaspora. And I think that is something that our governments are not paying sufficient attention to. Also understanding that it's not a one-size-fits-all scenario. Dominica has an energy demand of, you saw it, that a 10 megawatt geothermal plant will meet 100% of Dominica's energy demand. So how does Dominica develop its 100 megawatts of energy, of geothermal capacity? Yes, green hydrogen is one, but green hydrogen is still a new technology, but there are other things. Dominica can now look to sell itself as the first green port in the Caribbean. So to say to all the cruise ships that come in, and every time a cruise ship berths in Dominica, it uses up 5 to 7 megawatts of electricity. Say to those cruise ships, Royal Caribbean, Celebrity, Norwegian, shut down your coal-fired, your diesel-fired engines, and now plug into our domestic supply, which is being powered by renewables. You reduce your carbon footprint. We are now able to export energy. So we don't have to run underground undersea cables. We're exporting energy to Norwegian and to Royal Caribbean and to Celebrity. So I think those are some of the innovative things that we now have to start looking at to see how we can adjust Dominica's demand with Jamaica that has a much higher demand, or Barbados, or Trinidad and Tobago, which is another story that we don't have time to get into. So yes, I think it's really understanding that, but the final thing I want to say is leadership, and having an energy champion in each of these countries is extremely important. If you do not have somebody championing this, it will not go anywhere. We saw this in St. Lucia post-2016. When you had a regime change in St. Lucia after 2016, the energy trajectory went from here to there. It went from 0 to 0. And you must have an energy champion. Somebody must take this and urge the Prime Minister at yes, PM. Healthcare is important. Unemployment is important, but energy transition is equally important because it can help transform your economy in a way that nothing else can.
Absolutely. Yes, please. And I think what's remarkable about this is things like AI. They're complaining about how much energy AI is using. We have surplus energy potential in our region, and we could be a really great opportunity to green AI and to, co-develop along a better trajectory. The other thing you mentioned that I thought was such a brilliant insight earlier was about Mia Motley and the leadership that she's exacted on the region. But imagine when she ran, nobody else won any seats. So that gives you political capital that you can then use to make these kinds of development decisions. And so maybe she is the one because she doesn't have to think in 5-year terms. When you win in such a landslide election, you have a longer time frame to think about. So, you know, those are the circumstances on the ground. Rodden Law, I'll go to you. I want to close out with the woman power. Your final thought.
Okay, my final thoughts. I touched a little bit on innovation, the fact that we need to work more with the private sector. I just want to say partnerships are critical. And we've been using models that really have not really been grounded in strong partnerships to address this transition and other development challenges that we face. I think by establishing the fund that we've done, we have created a framework in which we can crowd in a lot of partnerships on the project development side and on the financing side. And if we are successful in doing this, we can replicate this and really accelerate this transition. And I think this is what the market needs, because a lot of this is new for the region. We've been working with traditional approaches to development financing. The governments are fiscally stretched. So we need to be able to reach out to partners who understand the context, like it has been explained to us, and who can come to the region knowing that there's a particular way in which you assess and perceive risks, and there's a particular approach that you need to take to manage your expectations. The projects are small scale, but they're impactful. As Jimmy was saying, there are some, if you can scale them and put the enabling environment in place, you can have some massive cross-border projects across the region. So I think we need to have partners to come in and work with us within our setting to see things from our perspective and to really engage in bringing more resources into the region to accelerate the transition and to push our sustainable development.
Phenomenal and so true. And on that issue of partnerships, and you mentioned it as well, and I think that it's a really important point about this moving from traditional sources of energy to renewables provides for us the opportunity for energy independence. And so the people who come in have to realize that it is in that partnership to make sure that, yes, seize the opportunity, help us with the foreign direct investment, but it has to be in collaboration. We cannot have only extraction taking place, right? Because we don't want to build a new foundation on the scaffolding of the old situation because it will collapse once again. And with that, Charlene.
A hard spot, you know, to close out. No pressure, no pressure. You know, I think the easy way is to +1, what has been said. But maybe I'll close off with a bit of honing in on innovation. And for me, what innovation means in the context of the Caribbean may not refer to technology, but business models. How can we innovate around business models? You know, we have to think about who will bear the cost of the transition. For us, you've already heard, the impetus for us, you know, really pushing this transition is energy security, is energy affordability. Yes, we care about the environment and global greenhouse gas emissions, but we're on the front lines of climate change while we are the least contributors. And so innovating around business models from the regulatory standpoint, pricing of energy, I think is one thing that I think that the region really needs to accelerate. I'm going to call for something, and that is let us bring back energy efficiency. It has totally died in our energy transition conversations. Renewable energy, of course, is powerful, but we talk about equity. Perhaps those who cannot afford solar panels, we can have programs that can incentivize energy efficiency for them, for the business world as well. Being dependent on tourism, how our hoteliers, you know, tuned into energy efficiency, what are some of the incentives there? Of course, I want to remind that 50% of our population is female, and so in a spirit of leaving no one behind, maybe closing off with woman power, you know, we need to put a little more emphasis on diversity and ensuring equitable access for all in our transition.
Thank you. I see you chomping at the bit for a question. And because I saw you first, and yes, and also for MSMEs, they're so important. And we have one of our dear MSMEs here, Grenada Grows, put up your hand. He wanted a shout out. So an MSME that we work with. Free plug. All right, let me have your question.
Maybe it's working. Yeah.
Yeah, okay.
Scott Bryson again from Orbital Farm and Impactful Capital. Love this panel as well. I love the ambition. I love all the innovation and opportunities. Scotiabank, a week and a half ago, announced they're doing a $350 billion allocation into climate. Scotiabank is an obvious key player in the Caribbean. Coming from a local perspective, $350 billion going into this space. All of these different project ideas, whether it's this technology, whether it's charging at the ports, whether it's solar deployment, the work in the financing, the feasibility study work. We need an allied climate partners fund for the Caribbean. We need one for each of those different islands, because the energy ambitions that we're talking about here, these require hundreds of projects to be able to deploy them. And that early stage equity capital, like this is an amazing opportunity. $350 billion from one bank. Now it's not just obviously just for the Caribbean, but anyway, I think, can you talk about accelerating the investable project opportunities, because the money's there to finance the deals?
Yes, okay. And I'm going to add a nuance to that question, because there is a lot of money, and you hear a lot about money. We have a pool of investors who are interested in investing in projects. But is it the right kind of money based on where the projects are? And that's the question I want you to ask. And I'm gonna start with you, Ronald.
I think we need to probe that a bit, because I've been hearing a lot about different funds. I followed an FT webinar just a couple of days ago, but when it boils down to what is effectively available for the Caribbean within the context of Latin America and the Caribbean, it is small. The reality is that it is small. But so we have to ask ourselves, why is this so? We need to be much more aggressive about developing our projects and clarifying the opportunities and promoting them, so that when these funds are established, there will be at the outset a bigger carve-out for the Caribbean to respond to the opportunities that are there. The market, the supply will not come to unless the demand is evident, which relates to a point that I was making earlier. What we have found is that the way to break that cycle is to put something out there which will draw the demand. But equally, we want those investors that have all of that capital to invest to look towards the Caribbean and to have carve-outs in their programs that respond to our realities and our opportunities. So that is the broad answer to whether it is the right capital for that. But then you need to actually negotiate that. You need to find those partners. I would want to know who within Scotiabank I would need to speak to that can say, okay, this is what we're looking at for the Caribbean. What are you doing? And then you say, okay, we have a pipeline. Let's build this out. There's a good match here. There's a good fit here. And these are the types of practical conversations that we need to have. But you can't have these in a vacuum. You need to have these in a structured framework. And I keep on going back to establishing things like funds that respond to the opportunities that could crowd in the investors and clarify the opportunities of investment.
Yes.
Can I also add, I think there is an issue, a deficiency that the Caribbean has to address, and that's the deficiency which Ronald spoke about in project preparation. Because when you look at just the mitigation end, and all of those projects that need to be addressed, that is a big ask of the Caribbean to prepare these projects to make them bankable projects. But we have not even looked at the other part, the resilience part, the adaptation part. So, we've been asking for money for adaptation. We're very vulnerable to climate change. At COP29 in Baku, we're going to be negotiating a new finance goal. Left to us, that finance goal should really be in the vicinity of $1 trillion, because we've seen that the needs for adaptation for developing countries right now are between $160 and $340 billion a year. The needs for loss and damage are around $400 billion a year. So when you add mitigation on that, we're probably talking over $1 trillion. So okay, let's assume that the heavens opened up and whoever is the Almighty smiled on us and gave us that finance goal of $1.5 or $1 trillion a year. We do not have the capacity in the Caribbean to start preparing those projects to draw down on those funds. And I think that is the point that we keep missing. That yes, we need the funds, we need the funds, we need the funds. But that's like asking for more branches of a bank to be open without an ATM, a card, so that you go and withdraw that money. And I think that's where we need to get our act together. We need to be able to develop those funds so that we have those bankable projects, so that we can go to, whether it's Roddy or whoever else is out there, and say, look, because there is no shortage of challenge in the Caribbean to be addressed, be it in mitigation or adaptation. But you would not know that from the pool of projects that we have available and that we're presenting for funding. And I think that is something that is on us and we have to address.
But, I see lots of hands going up. Yes. But I do want to ask you this, right? At CREF this year, we featured on our climate smart map, shameless plug, map.caribbeanaccelerator.org. There are 18 project preparation facilities for energy. And all of them are looking for projects to prepare, including RMI, who does a magnificent job of project preparation. With all those facilities available, then why aren't the projects prepared? And I'm going to go to you to hear your question and then ask you to tackle both.
Okay, thanks for that question. It allows me to say that we are very happy to have RMI as a partner in this. So that's part of the answer to the pipeline. Because what we found is that when we were looking to establish this facility, one of the concerns I had, which reflects what Jimmy was saying, is that you're going to set up this fund and you'll find that you don't have a strong pipeline of investable opportunities. So we've set up this technical assistance sidecar, which is a type of project preparation facility, which currently is underfunded. So we're looking for more partners on that. Because there's so many projects that have been coming to us. The fund manager has been obviously going out promoting the fund. And as we speak to our member countries, governments and the private sector, we're getting projects into the pipeline. So the fund, in terms of the total pipeline is probably now, it's still a modest number, but it's over 250 million. So the fund, the resources in the fund will not be able to obviously cover the full amount. So we're looking for parallel financing and co-financing to implement some of those things. So in terms of building the pipeline, we are open to ideas, projects in the region. If we have developers, persons with ideas to come to us, we have the ability to take these from concept right through, although we have a five-year investment period, so we need to move very quickly on that. So we'd obviously prefer to receive those that are at a certain stage of maturity, but we are open, we are flexible. And what we have already anticipated is that there's a need for us to go back out. Jimmy mentioned adaptation. So the CDF is in the process now of developing a new fund that is going to focus more on adaptation projects and more on projects that are likely to be more appealing to the public sector, because they're not obviously going to be generating revenues to pay back investors. And that facility we're targeting at about 250 million. So as we develop the pipeline for the CCRF, then we will find that there are projects that are more appropriate to be considered under that new fund. So we are building that pipeline as well. So we are open to ideas. We are also open to support from partners to beef up the project preparation facility that we have.
Any other?
Well, I can respond to your question unless Charlene wants to say something. Okay, so, and this is going to be controversial, but I have never liked to throw old solutions at a problem, well, solutions at a problem that have not worked. The problem we have with project preparation is that unfortunately we're trying to do project preparation within an antiquated structure of a public service that was not designed to do that. The public service in all of our jurisdictions really was not designed to operate with that level of nimbleness, that level of rapidity. The public service, and I'm speaking as a former permanent secretary, a former cabinet secretary, and a former minister of the public service. So I know how the public service operates. If you were to choose some bright, young minds out there and put them in a unit and say to them that you are going to get paid a commission of the money that you bring in from projects, you would see a pipeline of projects that this Caribbean has never seen before. Yeah. But the problem is you're asking people who part of their normal duties, whether they prepare these projects or they don't prepare these projects, they get paid. Yeah. So really there is no urgency on them to do this, and you can't ask the public sector to behave in a manner that is responsive to the needs of the private sector. It will not work. And unfortunately, our governments continue to do that, continue to throw an old construct at a problem that is as old as time itself. We have to approach this differently.
And maybe I can add one thing here, and that has been sort of the legacy challenge as well around de-risking. And I think investors are also not as encouraged to invest in the region if you're not seeing, and that is a legacy issue because one project starts and it doesn't get implemented and another. So, Dr. Fletcher mentioned that 12 megawatt wind farm project in St. Lucia, and frankly, it has turned away a lot of potential investors. One thing I think we don't speak about, and so there are many other things that are enablers. One thing is our land use policies around renewable energy and how that can, apart from regulations, which we have mentioned before in this discussion, but the land use policies that can give that confidence to investors to come into the region and make that money work for us.
Okay. I have one last question. I saw the gentleman in the blue shirt, and I would love to have his question before we close out.
Thank you very much. Charles Hamilton from the Bahamas. Okay, yes. Charles Hamilton from the Bahamas. Really enjoyed the panel. Agreed that the most ambitious NDCs we see come from small island developing states, come from our region. And just thinking about some of the challenges that we have to overcome. Thinking about my country, which is an archipelago, has to replicate these particular costs across 17 to 20 different islands. And then people looking at the economies of scale. This island has 1,000 people on it, but they need fresh water. They need affordable energy. How do we close that gap to ensure that we can get the type of investments that are needed? Because I can tell you right now, Prime Minister has been out there leading the charge. We have an OTEC project that's trying to be piloted across 9 different islands, which currently have water scarcity. If we can get this project running, you're looking at a triple win. You're talking about renewable energy provision, you're talking about fresh water provision, and you're talking about potential cooling, and we've used that cooling at one of the biggest hotels. And so it works, but being able to get this thing moving faster is what we need. So how do you see closing that particular gap?
All right, the issue of scale, excellent question.
Okay, so I think, and that's an excellent question. Wearing my former public sector hat, and I've worked at the regional level in the public sector, so to speak, I am an advocate for regional approaches. And I think we talk about economies of scale. We're small islands. We have similar needs. We're pursuing similar technologies. So mass procurement for me is one answer, as long as we could get it together. I mean, we do have the CICRI and other regional organizations that could help in that. On the more technical side, I also want to advocate for thinking about electrification in terms of our country. So a number of islands continue to use LPG for cooking. So electrifying our building sector, electrifying the transport sector will create the demand that will then create a better environment for economies of scale. So these will be my 2 top recommendations.
Yeah, and aggregating demand. We have to, but aggregating demand requires a harmonization of policy, requires the Caribbean to see itself as one energy market, as opposed to 15 different energy markets, because there are 15 independent or 14 independent member countries that are part of CARICOM. So harmonizing policy, harmonizing regulatory apparatus. I know it's difficult because everybody stands on their sovereignty, but in this case, we have to understand that the only way we will be able to attract those large investors that can come in and help drive the costs down is by aggregating demand. So instead of floating a 12 megawatt wind project in St. Lucia, we can float a 60 megawatt wind project across 4 islands in the Caribbean. Instead of floating one 4 megawatt solar project in St. Lucia, we can do 50 megawatts of solar plus battery across 6 islands, and that makes it a lot easier to manage. And I think that is the thing that we have to do. We have organizations like CCRE, Caribbean Center for Renewable Energy and Energy Efficiency, and that has to be part of its mandate. I said at CREF that CCRE deviated from its mandate a bit in previous years. We are going back to that mandate now, and with new management and trying to focus the attention there. But I think that has to be something that we look at. And also with the Bahamas, the whole question of microgrids. And microgrids are so important, not just for an archipelago like the Bahamas, but even for island states, for resilience. So if you now have microgrids, it means now that if you are impacted by a hurricane, it is much easier to bring back up your grid, as opposed to one grid that once it fails, then you have catastrophic failure that takes you a lot more time. So I think and microgrids are also important for dealing with this issue of just transition, because where governments very often look at putting in footpaths and other things as poverty reduction measures. Imagine if you put in a 100 kilowatt microgrid in a community, an impoverished community, and you have to say to the people who live in that community that for the rest of your life you will never pay for an electricity bill again, because the electricity that's generated by that microgrid will offset your electricity charges in every single household. So that $24 a month that you're paying to electricity, you can now invest it towards your child's education or towards food or something else. These are some of the innovative solutions that need to be employed, using energy as a catalyst. And I think, the opportunities are endless. It's just a matter of political will and a champion. I think that, unfortunately, is something in some jurisdictions has been lacking. Not in all, but in some jurisdictions has been lacking.
All right. Well, thank you so much for your captive attention. And thank you, panelists, my esteemed panel. And please go and surprise somebody today. Tell them Happy Julian Alfred Day, and let them ask you what it's about. All right?